So I've been mentioning about apps. I thought just to kind of get everybody going, I'll just illustrate one of these. Lindsay will take you through a lot more tomorrow on what's going on. But so we have the apps, and there's actually about 25 of them. I've talked about, well, at least mentioned 4 or 5 or 6 of them this morning. But here's one for DC resistivity, and what it does is allow you to solve the DC resistivity problem, or when you've got a target that's basically similar. So I don't know how many people here have ever been asked, but I have this happen a lot to me. People come up and say, well, can DC resistivity find a buried tunnel? So maybe I'll pose that question to you. So suppose somebody came up to you and say, oh, can DC resistivity be used to find a buried tunnel? What would your answer be?
Yes.
Yes.
Always.
Always. Ah, love it, yeah.
When you take the pros and the cons afterwards, once you heard the problem.
Okay, now we're getting a bit closer. Okay, so, well, as opposed to being so optimistic and saying yes, what other options might you try to do? Exactly. So, how big is it? How deep is it buried? Anything else?
Resistivity contrast.
Yeah, so you need to know the resistivity contrast with the host. So here's a tool that I think is really insightful. So the app looks like this. You can have an A and a B electrode in any place, and then an M and an N electrode. Here's your target. And then you've got parameters. You can move the locations of any of those electrodes. R is the radius of the tunnel, so let's build one. How big should it be? What do you want for radius of the tunnel? Oh, by the way, the limitations here, this goes from minus 40 to 40 meters, so something on that scale. What radius?
8.
How many?
8.
8 meters. Okay, so we're going to make a tunnel of 8 meters, and then how deep do we want to bury it? 20. Okay, so that's where it is. Good. Okay, so here's the here's the Earth model. We don't really see very much at this point because we don't have any resistivities. What would you like for background resistivity? 100 ohms, and then what about resistivity of the tunnel?
200.
So yeah.
So to the gentleman.
Okay, so there we have a tunnel that is the depth of the center is 20 meters. So that's your geometry. Now, if you look on here, there's a number of things that you could plot. There's fields, and so you can plot potential, the electric field, the currents, charges, sensitivity. So as I've been saying this morning, perhaps the most interesting thing, the first thing that you might want to do is look at the currents. So if I do that, there's my currents. It's a bit of a resistor. It's not a very big guy, but there's definitely some variations of the current lines in through here. So it's kind of deflecting a bit around. Then we can also, I talked a lot about charges. Okay, so suppose I got this kind of a system and I ask for the total charge. What would you expect to see? Anybody? What would be expect to see as far as where's the charges? Look. So I press charge. There's my total charges. So I was perhaps expecting to see something here. I don't. Why? It's my final DC system. That's all the, I'm plotting all the charges. What happened? I'm sorry? True. The bigger the resistivity contrast, the more charges that can make. But I don't even see anything here. Simon? Anybody? That's my total charges in the system. My electric potential that I obtained is the result of all those charges. Think about what your generator is. Your generator is like a big battery, right? So it's like putting a positive charge on one side and a negative charge on the other. If I look up here, that's exactly what I see. I see a big red dot and a big blue dot. And so I've got preponderance of my charges. So most of the charges are just primary. So if I look at the secondary charges, now I see something that's a little bit more like I was expecting, right? So I've got positive charges here, negative charges here. So I get positive charges because I'm going from a background to something that's more resistive. And if I get negative charges, I'm going more resistive to conductive. So it's a bit of a flip around. There's a couple of, I don't want to spend very long here because we're trying to get finished. But anyway, so that's kind of, so you can look at currents, you can look at primary currents, or so that's your primary current. Here's your secondary current. So these are the currents then that are in addition to what your primary currents are. So you can see they kind of look like a dipole. So you can play around with that. Notice maybe the one thing that I will show. Go back to the charge and secondary charge. Notice if I make it, instead of resistor, if I make it a conductor. So notice now I've got large negative charges on this side, large positive charges on that side. So depending upon whether the object is a resistor or a conductor, I can change the sign of those charges. The other thing that's kind of interesting here is configuration. Notice there's dipole, dipole, pole, dipole. There's also pole, pole. So in a pole, pole, then you're really only looking at an A electrode and an M electrode. A electrode for the current. This is kind of interesting. So if we look, maybe I need to go just touch. Okay, so here are A electrodes over here. Notice the charges that I've got here. So watch what happens as my A electrode gets up here. You can see how the charges. So you can see how, as the current electrode, so now when it's over here, the current's coming in like that. So start getting these negative charges, and as the current goes back and forth, these charges kind of flip back and forth. So that tells you a lot about the excitation and illuminating. So right now we've got a conductive body. If I go back to making it, oh, that's okay. Actually, so we got a background of 100 ohm meters, and my I'm going to put my current back here. So if I'm sitting here, so here's my M electrode here. Maybe we should kill this. Can we kill this light? Or does that just the white lights? Yeah. Ah.
That's almost done. You can take it over.
Yeah, I think that's good. Okay, so here's my A electrode, and you can see that that's establishing the current. So that's the excitation. Now we're going to think about the measurement. So if my M electrode is here, my apparent resistivity is 93.77, right? So it's lower than 100, which is kind of what you think, because this is supposed to be a conductor, right? What's going to happen if I bring this potential electrode over? Let's suppose I put it up here. So I don't change, I'm just moving my potential electrode. But now I'm sitting up over here, and it's dropped even farther. It's 92. But as I bring it back up here, this is going to work. Yes, okay. So it's sitting up over here. My apparent resistivity is now 101. Got it. So here's the point I wanted to make before. It's not the best example for illuminating this, but the fact is that the apparent resistivity is actually larger than the background, even though this guy is even more conductive. We actually exceed 100. And the reason for that, now you can understand where those pictures were coming from earlier. The reason for that is that this M electrode here is actually closer to these positive charges. So it's increasing the potential, hence the apparent resistivity is increasing. Over here, so here's the strongest part of the negative charges up close to the surface. So if I'm any place in here, I'm going to have a decrease in potential. So if I'm sitting up here, my apparent resistivity is 90 ohm meters. And that's simply because I'm really closest to these negative charges. Okay, so again, that kind of bifurcation. One is excitation, the currents, that tells you where the currents are flowing and where the charges are. And then the other is what you're actually measuring. And sometimes what you're measuring, even though you have a conductive object, depending upon where you are, you might have an increase in that resistivity or no. Okay, so you can kind of play around with that and yeah, ask yourself questions. Here's the important thing. I might even make this statement a couple of times. When you're given an app, there's sometimes a tendency just to like, oh, I'm just going to play with things and just watch images and see what I get. If you do that, you don't learn very much. What you should do with an app is, first of all, set yourself a scenario and then decide, okay, what's the question I'm going to ask? And then what am I expecting? So you have to sit down and think and maybe sketch things out. Okay, what do I expect the currents to look like? What do I expect the charges to look like? What about the electric fields? Or the primary, the secondary? What would I expect all those things to look like?
And then you sit down and you commit on a piece of paper or in your mind. And once you've done that, then you press the button. And it's at that point that two things happen. Either you get what you thought was going to happen, in which case you understand it, or you get something that's different, in which case you have something to learn. But that is the way to use an app, as opposed to just having something with some slider bars and messing around.
Okay. Let us go to the frequency domain. So here's where we were. We did time domain, and those were receivers. Now we're going to do a frequency domain and measure these as data. So we'll have the same sort of setup. We've got a homogeneous Earth, 100 ohm meter background, vertical magnetic dipole, say 20 meters above the surface. And if we look at the current density for this, everything here is going to be so parallel to what we did in time that I can just sort of flip through it. Again, the currents are going to be parallel to the loop. Here's currents kind of both coming in and going out, so we plotted the amplitude here. And the magnetic field looks like this. We're actually going to measure something up here. If I look at a high frequency, let's say 100 kilohertz, then here's my skin depth formula. And skin depth is 16 meters. And the currents are really kind of concentrated at the surface. You can see the magnetic fields are a bit complicated. If I go down, so if I now go to 10 kilohertz, the skin depth is 50 meters. And the currents are kind of fusing outwards and downwards. So just exactly as they did in time. Now I changed frequencies, the same thing happens. So here's the effects of frequency. As you increase it, currents kind of go down and out. And here's the magnetic fields. Again, if I put in either a resistor layer or a conductive layer, I'm going to see function. So it's exactly the same thing that we had before. 20 meter thick layer, and we're going to make it resistive and then conductive. Here we have our background. And now if I make it resistive, we're not going to see any currents that are happening in here. If I make it more conductive, I see some currents in here, some at the top. And I make it very conductive. Most of my currents are in the conductor, and they're not even getting all the way through. So exactly what we had in the time domain. And here's our magnetic fields that we're going to be. Okay, and we're going to measure something from up here. If you look at the sounding curves, now we have a real and imaginary part. So the imaginary parts in red, real parts in black. If I take that resistivity layer, put that in, see I don't have very much difference between the dashed and the solids, so I'm not very sensitive to that. But if I look at a conductive layer, now I've got a huge difference between what was there before and what there is with the conductor before the conductor, in both the real and the imaginary. And that's even more accentuated when I get down to 1 ohm meter. So back to our shielding problem now. Remember what we had earlier this morning? So we had the DC resistivity. We have this conductive layer down, or the conductive sphere down here. And then we put in that resistive layer. So what happened there, the currents all went up towards the surface. And we got a large apparent resistivity just based on that
on that shielding layer. So that was with DC resistivity. What's going to happen now with a frequency domain EM? Anna? Anybody?
We're going to see through it.
Pardon me?
We're going to see through it, aren't we?
Yeah, should be able to see through it, right? We've kind of already decided that if we have a resistor and an inductive system, that we're going to be able to see through a resistor. And so here's what we have. Here's the sphere, okay, it's just sitting in that background. And there's enough conductivity in here that there's currents up here, but we're still seeing the currents on the outside of the sphere. And now if I put a resistive layer in here, I basically don't change anything. So the currents there pretty much here, and then similarly is true with the sphere. So this gets us around that shielding problem that we had with the DC resistivity. This is probably one of the biggest benefits of something like an inductive source system when you're trying to look for conductors in a very challenging background. Yeah, that's just the effect. So again, what we see with the resistor and just the background, they're both, pretty much the same. So we can basically see through that resistive layer. DC resistivity with a conductive layer. Remember that was also shielding us. So in this case, the current went right into that conductor. So what's going to happen here? Yep. Somebody?
It's going to shield a little bit. Because you're reduced, so it's going to see something, but not as much as you did before.
So it should shield us a bit because we've got an EM signature. So this is what we had before with putting a thin resistivity. Now we put this conductive layer in here, and you're basically shielding out the sphere. So again, that conductor is soaking up all the energy, and you could be shielding yourself from this. Yeah. So the conductor with the sphere and just a conductive layer, currents look pretty much the same. So let's do frequency domain example, but with groundwater. So this is a place in Australia. It's called Bukpurnong, and it's the Murray River that's coming through here, sort of channeling down like that. So here's the area here, and what was really of interest here was the fact that we've got a lot of farming and irrigation up on sort of a higher level, and there's salts that are going to be coming down into this valley, into this floodplain. So the idea was basically motivated by the following. So you've got farming and irrigation that's sort of up here. There's the Murray River down here. Here's the water table. And as these salts come down, they just cause a lot of damage. So this is actually a picture of what the floodplain looked like after all the salts. So there's clearly a lot of ecological damage and just a lot of salinization. That's a huge amount of salt there. So what they wanted to do was to see, well, first of all, two things. They wanted to use this as a test site to kind of monitor things as a function of time. And they also wanted to see if they couldn't ameliorate the situation. And they were going to try to pump some of the water out here. So this is potentially saline water out here, and they got a pump. They're going to pump it out, and then they're going to put it up into the upper region in here, into kind of like a holding pond, and then just let it evaporate and capture the salts. That was one way of trying to do something, and that would kind of get fresh water back farther into the floodplain. And the other is that they're actually going to inject water into this floodplain region and see if they couldn't change things that way. So here's what they're doing. They're going to pump out at these locations, and they were also going to pump water in over here, and they were going to look at the effect of propagation of fresh water as they pump the water in. So what we're looking at here is January 2006. So the blue is basically fresh water in here, and from 2006 to March 2007, after they had been pumping fresh water in, the blue area sort of extended back. So that's a combination of pumping fresh water in and pulling water out of these back regions. So that was kind of okay, but what they really wanted to do was to see if they could kind of monitor what the whole situation was like and how things evolved over the years. Remember, this was 2006, 2007. So the properties of interest really boil down to fresh water and salt water. So salt water is very high conductivity, maybe 3 to 5 Siemens per meter, and fresh water was really low. So you really want to try to find the difference between fresh and salt just based on that conductivity. And here's the regions where the transects were taken. So they ran a number of surveys. They ran some frequency domain surveys, and they ran some SkyTem surveys. I think a number of people, including ourselves, have inverted both of those data sets. I'd shown you a SkyTem before, so now I'm going to show you a frequency domain resolve system. So here's a horizontal coplanar system. It has area from 380 to 130,000 hertz. So horizontal coplanar, maybe we kind of went through that. Each has got its own separation distance, and also had a vertical coaxial coil. So here's the bird, and it's going to be flown back and forth on the green lines. Actually, the red underlying those are the SkyTem data. So we take those data, and here's a result. The reason I like showing this is that it's kind of a good point to make a personal calibration for yourselves as far as what you've learned or not since 9 o'clock this morning. And the thing that you might try to recollect is if I had shown you this picture when you first came in this morning, like what you would have gleaned, if anything, from that picture. And then you can kind of ponder that just for a second, and then we're going to kind of step through some of the details on that picture. And I think between those two endpoints, you can kind of make a decision about what you've learned or what extra insight you've got. Okay, so first of all, we see horizontal coplanar data, HCP. So now you know what those are. We've got frequencies here. So there's a low frequency, a high frequency. So which frequency is going to see deeper? Low, yeah. Is that then skin depth, right? We've got in phase real, quadrature phase imaginary. Right, so now we know what that is. That's just that partitioning. So you know what the real, the imaginary parts are. So this is your data. This is kind of a ratio of the secondary to the primary fields. So the red is high, so that should be indicative of something that's conductive. Blue is low, so that should be resistive. Other things that are kind of interesting, if we look at this, so this is a sounding curve that we have. So at one particular point here, first of all, term sounding curve. Secondly, here's the in phase and here's the quadrature phase. Now this question of, okay, does that resonate with you at all? Or I mean, if you saw that before, is that just, you know, 2 lines going on the paper, or can you add some more insight to it? Well, first of all, if you were shown data that looked like this, what would that say about which side of the response curve you're on for an EM system? You're on the high induction number or the low induction number? You're at the high induction. Why? Perfect. So induction number, remember that was like omega L upon R, but you can kind of think as being frequency. So as you go up in induction number, you're also going up in frequency. And now look at this. So you're over here, okay, you're on this side. The higher the frequency that you go, the bigger the real part is and the smaller the imaginary part. So that's entirely in accordance. Okay, so connectedness and just being able to, you know, look at images that a geophysical company would show you and kind of get some insight, just is good to have. Now we do the interpretation inversion. So this is going to be a 1D inversion. So it ends up giving us a result that looks like this. So this is the electrical conductivity at about 8 meters depth. And we've got some high values through here and some low values out through here. And the interpretation, this is what was really of interest, is what's the flow of both the salt water and the fresh water? And clearly from up in this region in here, you can see how everything is really high conductivity. So the interpretation is that you've got salts that are kind of coming down and going into the into the river. So these salts would then get carried down this way. Also out here in these blue areas, you've got fresh water, and those fresh water seems to be seeping out down this way. So that provides a lot of kind of essential information to, you know, sort of the overall groundwater hydrology of what's there. And now as a final kind of synthesis, sort of putting all this together, this is sort of the framework that we have. We've got the all the irrigation going up here. The salts are coming into the Murray River. In some places, they're kind of flowing in. Other places, the fresh water is coming out. So that was of interest in 2006, 2008. It's continued to be of interest. And there was a subsequent SkyTem, when was that, 2015? that was flown. And so now we actually have a time lapse of what happened in 2008 compared to 2015. So you could do some kind of monitoring and gain some information, some insight about what's going on. I'm not going to go through that. I'll just flip this through this so you can just see what's there. If people are interested in like any of these case histories that we're not really going through, then we can do that tomorrow. We have lots of time. But this is actually a landslide in Austria, and
it caused considerable damage. And what they're really interested in is to see if they couldn't use electromagnetic geophysics to get some information about what's there. So they had developed their own system. So it's a frequency domain system, and it was an opportunity to kind of look for kind of clay layers which absorb a lot of water and could therefore be cause a problem with respect to yeah, so it's a frequency domain system. Showed the correlation of low resistivity with regions that had landslides before. So in the end, it just turned out that mapping the electrical resistivity of that region was pretty good at helping them find regions where the a lot of these clay layers. Oh, this, let me just show you.
So we were in Tokyo, and I met a good friend of mine, Yuji Mitsuhata, who is head of the sort of AIST, which is one of their national labs. And I was asking Yuji, I said, well, what are you guys doing? What kind of problems are you working on? And he said, well, here's our brochure. And on the front page of his brochure was the following. It's this image here. And I don't know, just something that really resonated with me. Because so what we got in here? We got hydrocarbons, oil, natural gas, looking for that, methane hydrates, soil and water contamination, groundwater, especially sea, freshwater interfaces, CO2 sequestration, radioactive waste disposal, hot springs, geothermal reservoirs, mineral deposits, and yeah, mining. So, here's all the places that are relevant, or areas are relevant for Japan, and all of those EM has some role to play. I thought you might be interested in this because we were just talking. I was talking to Niels about drones. They had an earthquake in Japan, and it caused a landslide, and stuff comes down and buries a couple of cars. And so what they realized is they didn't have a quick way of responding to something like that. And so they decided to build a drone system so that it might be able to image buried vehicles. Right? So you quickly want to do that. I think this is interesting from a couple of perspectives. So we've talked about principles, but the one thing about electromagnetic geophysics is it can be scaled up or scaled down. And here's a case where you're just scaling it down. So it's just kind of like that resolve system. You've got a number of coil transmitters and a number of receivers. You're going to attach it to a drone, and then you're just going to fly the thing. One of the things that's important to have some understanding about is the noise in the system. In this case, it was the drone itself that was causing a lot of noise. So if you hung your instrument 3 meters below the drone, then you ended up with signal that looked like this, so it's really spiky. If you did it 4 meters, you got the red line. If you did it 5 meters, you got blue. So I mean, in order to get the noise level down, you needed to be 5 meters below. For data acquisition, the basic principles, fields fall off as 1 over r cubed. So you've got to be close to the ground, and then you can still only see something that's limited to depth. They thought maybe 1.5 to 3 meters. So they flew this drone back and forth, and what you're looking at here is the plot of the data, but just the in-phase component. And you only need the in-phase because we're looking for metals, and we're at that saturation part, so we're at that inductive limit. And what we see is that there's a big cross here, so that, I think in Japanese this says car that's buried 1.5 meters, but we're not sure. And And this signal up here is the one that was at 3 meters depth. We have a lot of other material on unexploded ordnance. I'm not sure. There seemed to be some interest. We were talking at lunch. There's some interest in unexploded ordnance in Denmark, and we have a tutorial on that. We also have case histories. That's that case history. HeliSam was the one I was referring to earlier. We've got a loop transmitter, so it's an inductive source loop, and then you're measuring. It's a time domain system, and you're measuring the total magnetic field in the air, and then using that and converting that. And there's another one for minerals exploration, which is kind of nice because it takes an example of something that you're looking for, and then looks at 3 or 4 different types of EM surveys to see which one might be best. And it turns out in this case, ERT did not win, so the EM. Anyway, all of these slides are available. You can take a look at anything tonight and see if you want to know more. Okay, I'm going to start to put things together. So we're now going to do grounded sources. So grounded sources play a big role in a whole variety of problems. So anything that's marine EM is usually has a grounded source. So that may be hydrocarbon de-risking, maybe methane hydrates, things like large-scale structures, sort of volcanoes could be useful for this. And I'll show you an example for large-scale work in India. But here's the basic experiment. So what we talked about this morning, first of all, we did DC resistivity, right? And there we had all these charges that were built up. And then we did inductive sources, and we had all of these induced currents. Right? What we want to do is put that together. So we're going to take a grounded source, but we're going to have a time varying field on it. So as far as this object that's inside here, there's going to be charges that are built up, and there's going to be induced currents. So we want to kind of see what's going to happen. So we're going to set a little bit of intuition here first before we tackle that, and that is to, let's say we have an electric dipole in a whole space. So electric dipole is just a little piece of wire with a little generator on. We're just going to put that into into the earth, into the whole space, and look to see what happens. At steady state, the electric fields and the currents look like this, like a dipole. And then the question is, if I turn that off, what's going to happen? So imagine I just got a little segment of current that's going in there, and now I'm just going to shut it off. Then what's going to happen? Any takers? Suggestions? Well, let's look. So again, there's an app to generate this. So let's suppose I look at 10 to the minus 4 milliseconds. That's pretty early. That's a tenth of a microsecond. And my currents look like this. My diffusion time is 4 meters. So you can see the currents right there. 10 to the minus 3, they look like this. The later, it's like that, later, later. Now these are all big yellow spots, and you probably can't see the labels, but the dynamic range on here is changing. So this is 10 to the minus 0.4, that's 10 to the minus 4, 10 to the minus 5, 7, 9. So the current that was initially there is just fading out, and so it's diffusing out, and it's just dying. Okay. So this is an important sequence of slides because it tells you a couple, well, it tells you one really important thing, that suppose if I have a current that's inside a homogeneous medium, and now I just let that current go, then what's going to happen to it? It's basically going to kind of spread out and just die away. Okay? Time domain versus frequency domain. The only difference was, so in the time domain, we shut the waveform off. There's no primary. We just measure in the off time. In the frequency domain, then the primary current's always on, and my data are partitioned into the real and the quantitative. So in frequency domain, and here's, this sequence of slides is actually really good for giving torquing your mind around to thinking between frequency and time, because to first order, what you see in a frequency domain experiment is the same as the inverse of that frequency to give you a time. In other words, a time of 10 to the minus 4 milliseconds and a frequency of 10 to the 4th kilohertz have the following things: a depth of diffusion and a skin depth. So things look like this. At a bit later and lower frequency, looks like that. Later, 10 to the minus 2, kind of like 100 kilohertz. So the exact number for diffusion distance and skin depth, they're not exactly equal, but they're pretty similar. And later it goes like this, and then like that. So what we see is the following. When you have a current and you just allow it to go away on itself, that the currents diffuse into the earth, and early times after shut off, or high frequencies in a frequency domain experiment, these two guys look the same. And similarly, at late times and low frequencies, they'll also look the same. Okay, so that's your connection between time and frequency. Okay, now we've got all of the little pieces that we need to take this next step. And this is a bipole source. So we've got an A electrode and a B electrode, and we can either put them on a straight line or we could put it in on a horseshoe. They either are done, and what we want to do is sort of see how things go. So we're going to try to get some insight about that, but there's lots of variables, and it's most easy just to kind of think of a simple example. So here's the one that we're going to do. We're just going to take a homogeneous Earth and have this generator. It's connected. Here's the A electrode. Here's the B electrode. So the currents are kind of going to go like this. Okay, that's steady state. What is going to happen if I turn the current off? It's actually easier to think about this in two parts. The first part is just, let's consider a straight wire, and then just think about a wire. I got a wire carrying a current, right? And then I'm going to switch my current off. What is going to happen? Yeah.
So you're going to get an opposite reaction from the Earth. I mean, it's going to try to counteract you changing the fields.
Okay, yeah, so I've got a time varying current, or time varying, yes, time varying current is time varying magnetic field. And yeah, so so what were we saying, that you get a current in the opposite direction? Okay, so get a current that way. Anybody else? How about back here? So, yep.
I don't have any idea.
Okay. How about the sky temp guys?
I imagine that the flux would need to be maintained at all points, as well as much as possible to basically get a mirror image of the original current at the exact terminal.
Okay. So we had two things. One is that we're going to have a mirror image of this current, in which case it's going in that same direction. And the other is that we oppose, so we get a current in the opposite direction. Okay. There are two opposite things. Who's going to vote for? Which one do you want to vote for? Who's going to vote for going on the opposite direction? Well, there's going to be a lot of abstainers here out there. Who's going to vote for being in this direction?
Is it right when you turn it off, right?
Yeah, the moment I turn it off, I just got to take this. I'm just going to crank it off. So the question is, what's going to happen? Okay, I think Nicholas is right. Yeah, so flux, you're going to try to make, the world works on a system where it doesn't like change the flux, it's going to try to maintain the flux. At the moment I turn this thing off, somebody just, like a short ways away from me, is not going to notice any difference. So that means that there will be a current that then is transferred to the Earth. It'll be kind of a mirror image of this current here. So here's the interesting thing. The moment I turn this current off, there's now going to be a reaction by the Earth such that there's going to be an image current here that maintains that flux. So the current kind of gets transferred from the wire. So it used to be the wire, and now it's directly beneath the wire. It's in the Earth. If we could look early enough in time, that current would be just right at the surface of the Earth, directly underneath that wire. Okay, so now we transferred the current from the wire to the Earth. Now what's going to happen? So now we got a current that's in the Earth. What's going to happen to that? Yeah. It'll decay, right. So now we're back to the same as that grounded dipole, right? So that's exactly what's going to happen. The moment that we turn that current off, we now have this current that's induced in the Earth, and that is going to then, decay downwards, outwards, and just disappear. Okay, so that's that current. Okay, what about this other stuff, all those grounded currents? What's going to happen to them? Anybody? So they were there. They were always going from A to B. Well, there are all these currents here. What's going to happen to them?
The same thing. The same thing as with the current in the wire.
Yeah. So, well, yeah. These currents here now are basically going to act just like they're already in the ground, right? So they are going to just simply disappear, just like that grounded dipole. So those currents are kind of going to go sort of downward and outward. So that's it. So basically, a grounded wire then has got these two components with it, and it's important to kind of think about, okay, what's the wire doing and what's everything else doing? So let's just look at the currents in half space. So now we've got a positive current here, a negative current here, and we get currents that are going like this, and this is just before turn off. And at different times, so we can see immediately after we turn the current off, it's all kind of confined up to the surface, and then gets deeper, gradually decays down. Again, these color scales are greatly changing, so it's 10 to the minus 3, minus 5, minus 6, 7, and 9. Okay, but you can see what happens. The current immediately gets transferred from the wire to the earth, and then whoosh, sort of disappears. Okay, so we got there. We're getting close. We got a grounded wire. But now generally what we're interested in is looking at, we're trying to find a target. So now what we need to do is think through what happens if we put a target in there, and if we can figure out what's going on. So suppose I got this guy here. So he's a conductive plate, and I've decided to put a grounded wire right over the top. So I've got an A electrode here and a B electrode here, right? What am I going to expect as far as the effects from the wire itself? So I now have something that looks like this. So I've got a magnetic field, right? And then I'm going to turn that magnetic field off. So what's going to happen in this plate?
Yeah, it's actually good at keeping the flux from the source even after it's turned off in the perpendicular plane.
Right. So I've got this flux that's coming in. I'm going to try to keep that flux. So now there's going to be a current that's going in this direction, and that's going to have that same flux. So there's going to be an eddy current in here, right? At the same time, there was also this galvanic current. That was the DC resistivity part, right? So what we see with this example is that if we had, let's say, a block in half space, then the DC resistivity has got some good coupling, right? So we go positive to negative. So we've got lots of charges that build up. And we also have these vortex currents. So we've got current that goes along here, that's magnetic flux, take it off, and then we're going to get currents that are in here. And that means also that, yeah, we're actually good to go. Well, the other thing is, as these currents from here sort of diffuse down, then they're going to give us currents that are going through this way. So that's going to give us like galvanic currents that flow through here. So we've got a number of things that are happening. We're going to have vortex currents that are coming from there. And then in addition to that, we're going to have these currents that are kind of going to diffuse in. But that kind of looks like that would be good coupling. We should be able to find that conductor. So let's just see how that works. So let's put a conductor in here. You can tell it is a conductor. You can see how the current lines are coming in. And now I turn this off, and look what happens right at very early time, 0.04 milliseconds. So these are the currents in the plate, and the solid lines are the current lines. So look to see how circular they are. So those are vortex currents that are operating in that conductor. A little bit later, everything starts to diffuse through, and currents are sort of diffusing in. And here, the magnitude is down, but you can certainly see how those are kind of circular. And the interesting thing that happens here is that at these late times, the current lines have kind of gone sort of straight through. So that's more like a galvanic source, and that would build up charges on these ends, so that you'd see with a voltmeter and stuff. Okay, so that's the process. There's quite a few things going on here. So in summary, at before shutoff, we just have galvanic currents. Then after shutoff, we've got these vortex currents that are going in here. And at very late times, we're back to just galvanic currents. Okay, that's a conductor. Oh, actually, so one of the things about understanding the currents is that you can then get a sense about, okay, which field should I measure? Okay, so in this case now we understand the currents. So if those are the currents, what fields would we measure? So we got, let me give you a hand since it's getting late in the afternoon. We got, what fields do we have? We've got E fields, we got B fields, right? Electric and magnetic fields. Which of those fields do we want, and what components do we want? Yeah, somebody? Oh, yes.
E field along the line and B field across.
Yeah, perfect. So if we measure, so you look at these charges, so if we measure an electric field across here, there's your DC experiment. That would be good. And the B field perpendicular to that, right? Because we've got currents that are producing magnetic fields that go like this. So at right above the wire, magnetic fields are kind of pointing. So let's just take a look at the E fields. So here's what you'd have with the half space. Here's with the conductor. At very early times, you get that comparison. But look at 1 millisecond. It's hugely different in character. There's lots of signal here. And at 10 milliseconds, it looks like that. So measuring the electric field in that inline direction would be a really good idea.
This was at the surface, though.
Pardon me?
This was at the surface?
Yeah. Yeah. And here's your By field. So that's also going to be good to use. So here's with the half space, here's the conductor. And here's at 1 millisecond. So notice the strong signal at 10 milliseconds. So those are two good. Anything else that we might want? Other field? Is that it? If you had to measure one more field, which one would you do? Well, the magnetic field from that wire is coming up on this side of the wire. It's going down on that side of the wire. So that means if I measured the Z component of the magnetic field, I might do pretty well. Okay, and we can see that. Okay, so that's if I have a conductor. That'd be that. What happens if I put a resistor in? So we're kind of revisiting the same questions, but in just a slightly different wrinkle each time. Now I put a resistor in. So first of all, you see that on DC, the currents are kind of going around the resistor. If I look at what the currents are a short time after cutoff, so I now see currents that are induced in the top region, but look at my block. So I don't have any vortex currents. I don't have any conductivity. I got electric field, but I don't have conductivity. So a little bit later, it looks like this. A bit later, it looks like that. Later, it looks like that. So I got a resistor. I don't get any induced currents. And so I'm just left with purely a galvanic signature that looks like that. So here's my resistor at steady state for the DC resistivity. It's just galvanic currents. Same here, same here. So given that, which fields now would you measure? So you know the currents. So if you know the currents, then you should get some idea about, okay, which fields do I want to measure? Anybody? I'm going to make all you guys stand up and do 10 jumping jacks or something. Or 20. Yes?
You don't get any deep fields anymore.
Yeah, we'd expect that most of the information is coming from the electric fields. And here they are, information from the electrics. So very strong. If I measure the magnetic field By, yeah, it's pretty minimal. And there's something there, but you have to dig. And for Bz, there's really not very much. So in summary, this is what we have. Here is our half space. If we put a conductor in it, no problem. Ex, By, Bz. If I put a resistor, Ex, By, Bz. So I might as well just, first order, measure the electric field. And actually, if you think back, I'm not sure whether people have been really following the whole marine EM business with trying to find hydrocarbons at depth. Question is, okay, what did they use for a survey? First of all, you're looking for a resistor so that you're not going to get strong EM induction effects. And secondly, you're going to have a grounded source. So you have a grounded source that's coming in. And really, it's basically a galvanic experiment. So you're just going to look at electric dipoles that are measured. So that's sort of the basis of that whole experiment. Okay, so now if we come back to thin plates, you can see things are going to get complicated. At some level, there's some intuitive understanding, like, okay, if you had an example like this, it might give you good coupling both with the DC resistivity and the M. This might not be so good. But yeah, at some point, you realize, like, I just need to do forward modeling. There's just so many things going on here that it's really difficult to kind of talk your way through things and decide who is bigger at which time. So let's do a short case history. This is, actually, I won't do this case history, but here's a slide that kind of emulates things with respect to the marine EM. Okay, so basically what they're looking for are these layers under here, which could have hydrocarbons in them. Hydrocarbons are resistive, and they're trying to get energy down into here and make a proper survey. So they have a transmitter out here. It's basically just a generator connected to two ends of a wire. So it's an electric dipole up here, and then the electric field lines kind of go like that. So there's your currents. And if the currents go through there, you're going to get charges that are built up, and you can measure potentials out here. This depth here is about 2 kilometers in a lot of cases. And I mentioned this factor of 3 before. So you need to have an offset between transmitter and receiver that's a factor of 3 times the depth. So it means you need 6 kilometers of cable. In this case, they actually had 8. That's a big experiment, right? You got a boat, you got this transmitter, 150 meters long, and then you got 8 kilometers of cable that are collecting electric fields up there. So that's a real serious experiment, right? just yeah, boggles the mind. And then they put this out joint with a seismic cable, right? So they actually had 2 cables going up. Deck and traps. Who knows something about Deccan traps? Why are they important? Why are they interesting?
The basalts.
The basalts, yeah,
It's one of these floods, basalt provinces.
right. And why is it interesting?
It's in the middle of India, there's lots of people with no water.
Well, that's true. Yep,
And it's very hard to image through with any other kind of seismic techniques.
that's true. Yes.
It's everything.
So basalts really throw heck into seismic analysis, right? Fracturing all over, lots of reverberations. From a layman's perspective, why are the Deccan basalts interesting?
I guess they occurred just when the dinosaurs disappeared.
Yeah, so for a long time, there was a lot of controversy about why did the dinosaurs die out? Was it just this prolonged eruption of millions of cubic kilometers of basalt, or and then because you get all these gases, and so you get all kinds of cooling of the earth and preventing sunlight from coming down. But then, of course, as time has evolved, they've realized that almost coincidentally, in a time frame, had this huge meteorite impact in Chicxulub in Gulf of Mexico. That looks like that's the definitive nail for getting rid of the dinosaurs. But it actually may be that this kind of marginalized them somewhat before.
The dangerous conversation in this country.
Pardon me?
This is a dangerous conversation to get into. There's a lot of controversy around this.
Oh, is that right?
Because one of the type localities is about 20 hours drive from Copenhagen.
So one of the what?
The type localities, the fish clay.
Oh, okay.
So at the time, it was a big discussion.
Oh, okay.
There's a lot
Well,
of people who
that looks like that's worth following up. Yeah. This is an old example, but it's still kind of interesting. And also I like the scale of it, because you're not just looking at a couple of meters. This is a seriously large scale. The motivation was actually hydrocarbons. There should have been sediments underneath these basalts. And the question is, okay, where are the sediments? How thick are they? And then are there any hydrocarbons there? Prior to this, it was actually believed that there were sediments underneath and they thickened towards the south. Okay, it's fine. And really, that's kind of the question. They had done some work, DC resistivity, on a long line of here. So that was quite a few years ago, and they ended up with a profile that looked like this. So the basalts are this region up here, maybe in this case, kilometer and a half thick. Then you've got sediments and then basement up here. So that was what they had from the DC resistivity. And yeah, weren't quite sure whether that was right or what. So they decided to do a grounded source EM experiment that looks like this. So you take a wire, a transmitter length 1 or 2 kilometers, and then you set up stations that are measuring both the electric and the magnetic fields at places like this. And then you're going to collect data at these places and invert them. So there's going to be like 10 lines of data that they're going to be characterized by L, R, J, K. We're going to kind of just look at a couple of those. Before you go out and do anything, you go to survey design. So in this case, it was pretty simple. Looking basically for a 1D Earth, and the first question was, okay, what about the thickness of the basalts? Could you distinguish between a 1.5, a 2, and a 3 kilometer thick basalts? And when you take the data, convert them to apparent resistivity, and here's time on this axis. So this is kind of like a decay curve, a sounding curve. Apparent resistivity, and you see that, okay, these curves are significantly different, so they must be sensitive to the thickness. And similarly, they also are sensitive to the value of the sediments. So this is 20 to 50 and 100. Different thickness or different conductivities of these sediments could be noticeable. So that gave him some confidence, like, okay, go out. Maybe this is a well-planned experiment. So they collected data. I'm just going to briefly mention a couple things. So this is L here. So remember, they have a whole bunch of these stations. So at each station, you could do your own 1D inversion. And when you do that, you ended up with an upper region of basalt here, then sediments, and then basement. So that's the thickness of the sedimentary layer, which was about 1 kilometer. When you look at section G down here, you get the same kind of thing with the thickness of sediments to be much less. And when you get down to K, then the sedimentary thickness is gone. The impact of this was that it was entirely opposite to what the geologists had previously thought, because they thought the sedimentary thickness increased towards south, but it went the other way. In electromagnetics, we're not talking about non-uniqueness today, but there's sort of fundamental trade-offs in conductivities of objects and thicknesses and that. But the one thing that's really important is something called the conductance. So that's the conductivity thickness product. And when you do a conductance map of that portion of India, you find that, so the red scale is high conductance, the blue and black is low, that the greatest conductances were sort of up in this region. So they actually used that information and they put a drill hole through. And this is kind of what they got. So prior to doing the drill hole, they have interpreted that, okay, there should be an upper region of basalt going down to about 1.5 kilometers, then another 1.5 kilometers of sediments, and then more basalt. So that's what they got from a really, like, this is really simple inversion analysis, but that's what they got out. So they drilled, and this was the result that they obtained. So this upper region here is in fact basalt layer. This region in here, this is geologic description of everything. We won't go through it, but this is basically your sedimentary packet, and then here is your basement. So it's actually kind of a nice, kind of example of the effectiveness of the EM in that case. There's a couple more topics to talk about, but I think I'm not going to do them now. I'm going to make one. Let's see. Yeah, maybe I can get by with just one slide. Okay, here's the gist of it, and this actually might be of interest to people here tomorrow, and I can certainly do that. So what we've been talking about with the DC resistivity experiment is that you turn it on, and you turn it off, and then you, well, rats. So we haven't talked about IP. So there's going to be a signal in there. So I'm caught between a hard place, but okay, so if I take a signal like this and turn it off, so let's suppose I'm just doing a DC, you're going out and you're going to do a DC IP experiment. For those people who don't know anything about IP, just bear with me. But for the people who do, there's a signal that is coming down at late time in the off time. But the moment that I have a transmitter and I turn it off, then I'm going to have an inductive response. Okay. So this is going to be a response just from EM induction. And generally, this signal that's in here is thrown away. It's actually considered to be noise in many experiments, and people just don't want to see it. So it's thrown away. And yet, what this little small case history does, and I can certainly talk about it tomorrow, is that there is a lot of information in there when you do an IP survey. If you can go back early enough in time, remember about transient EM. Recover that signal and do something with it. You can help yourself. For those who are interested, there's a case history on the Barents Sea, so that's useful for trying to discriminate between stuff that has high hydrocarbon concentration versus something that is just water or fizz gas. And oh yeah, we've got a whole bunch of stuff on marine EM, and that's probably it. The marine EM problem was really interesting because there's something called the air wave that will cross up. So what I think, let's see, when did we start? Oh, 1:15. Why don't I do natural sources, and then we'll have a break for coffee, we'll come back, have a group photo, and then I'll finish up with GPR and IP. Okay. How many people have heard of MT, magnetometers? Do you find that all Danish people, when asked a question, to raise their arm, kind of go like this, or do they actually go like that? Outside observation. Canadian. So we're actually not doing too badly, right? So we did DC resistivity, inductive source, EM, and grounded source, EM. So that actually covers quite a bit. There's a lot of systems out there that do it. What I'd like to now to do is to do natural sources. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background and motivation. The motivation is really this. It's a question of scale. So here's some problems for which it's actually a little bit difficult to get enough energy into the ground and to see things at a particular scale. So let's suppose you got volcanoes. Yeah, maybe that could be 5, 10, 20 kilometers across. Base of salt, many kilometers. Geothermal reservoirs, many kilometers. Groundwater issues on a large scale. Mineral targets. You get these porphyry deposits in Chile. They could be like 20 kilometers long. And then tectonic settings where you got a lithosphere going down into the asthenosphere. So the big issue here is getting energy into the ground, right? Remember I was talking about moment? Well, yeah, it's all about getting, it's all about exciting the object. So this maybe lays it out a little bit more clear. If we have a controlled source, so we've got some kind of a loop, then if that's acting like a dipole, you've got a 1/r³ decay down to your target, and you've got a 1/r³ decay from your target to the receiver. So that's a 1/r⁶. So r⁶ is a really kind of big number. What you'd really like to have, like imagine if we didn't have to worry about this guy. We didn't have to worry about that geometric attenuation. It'd be great. We're always going to have to contend with this because you've got a confined target here, and things are going to be going over 1/r. But this guy here, we could get it if we could use plane waves. Remember I talked about plane waves earlier, right? So big sheet currents going down. So the idea is that, like, if you could make a loop that was, sort of a couple hundred kilometers on the side, put it up in the air, you'd be in pretty good shape. That would give us that would get rid of that decay. We can't do that, of course, but we can rely on Mother Nature to do this. So here's the schematic, not to scale, of the sun and the Earth. So here's the Earth has a magnetic field, right, that kind of dipolar inside, but gets sort of swept back. There's this constant stream of charged particles called the solar wind that just sort of blows everything back. And yeah, the Earth's magnetosphere looks like that. And in fact, you have to be very thankful that it does exactly that, because without that magnetosphere, we would not be here. It's the only thing that's protecting us from, you know, the cosmic rays and the ultraviolet radiation and stuff like that. So without a magnetosphere, there would be no life on Earth. So we can be very thankful if that happens. We have a lot of really interesting disturbances that come along here that ultimately give rise to aurora. So my guess is that Denmark aurora is pretty common, is it, or no? How many people have seen aurora?
In Denmark?
In Denmark?
Yeah, in Denmark. Well, okay, any place then. Yeah. Oh, I guess. It's so cold up here and dark. I thought, like, I just shoot, like, okay, we'll go out and see the aurora. That's what I was planning to do on Tuesday night after we finish the disc. I just go out and hang out and look at the aurora. Maybe not.
It's always raining.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so for those who have seen it, it's spectacular. I'm going to show you a little video in a second about some of the things that give rise to it. The other thing that we have as far as natural sources, lightning. So, you know, lightning, that's moving charges from the Earth to the clouds, and moving charges mean currents, and currents give rise to magnetic fields, and those are time-varying magnetic fields, and they induce stuff. So anything like that goes. So what you're now going to look at is a movie. This is the sun, and there's going to be an eruption, a solar flare, solar storm, and that's going to put charged particles, blow charged particles out, and those charged particles are going to make their way to the Earth, interact with the Earth's magnetosphere, and then undergo quite a remarkable event, which is through what's called field line reconnection, have these particles come back and funnel into the Earth's magnetosphere and eventually cause the aurora. Okay, so that's what we're going to see. So there's the explosion. There's particles coming up. So now those particles interact with the Earth's magnetosphere and they get blown around, right? So they get swept around. And then they kind of get trapped inside these field lines, and then suddenly there's that connection process. And then all the particles get funneled down into what's called the auroral electrojet region. So it just sort of lines that up. So it's all kind of cool. Just play, it's worthwhile. At this day in the afternoon, it's worthwhile watching 200s. I suppose listening, it's not bad. Check this out. Comes around. This process is really complicated, and I couldn't explain it for the life of me, but you can see what happens. The field lines kind of go around these particles, so they're kind of folding them in, and then, you know, any particle then that's coming down, you know, is going to spiral along the field line. So it's a V cross B thing, right? And then the particle comes down into the ionosphere, which is from 100 to 500 kilometers above the Earth, very highly conducting. And the particle hits one of the atoms up there, maybe oxygen or nitrogen. So excites that atom into an upper state. And then when that atom decays back, it gives off a photon. And depending upon, you know, whether it's nitrogen or oxygen, you get different colors of the lights. And then because it's so dynamic, everything is just, you know, sort of swirling around. I mean, it's absolutely magnificent. You just like completely hypnotized by just watching everything goes. Okay, so how does that, how's all that stuff useful? Well, we got those storms. We also have lightning strikes that come in. So lightning strike, that's just a current that's going in. But you have to think about the Earth. The Earth is a big conductor. I mean, the atmosphere is really resistive, right? So the Earth is really conducting. And then I talked about this ionosphere up here with just ionized particles. That's also very conductive. So if I take an electromagnetic wave and put it in here, it actually bounces around. It's just like a waveguide. So it'll go continually around the Earth. And so you can have like a lot of lightning strikes in the tropics, and you'll still feel their effect up here. So these waves, as they travel, kind of travel as plane waves. If we look at the energy spectrum of the magnetic field, kind of looks like that, gradually increase. This is period time. So the longer the period, the higher the energy. And you know, there's a little bit of a dead band in here, low energy region that exists, but different story. Okay, so I said the waves travel as plane waves. And you know, everybody's familiar with Snell's law, right? You get light comes in, different refractive index gets changes in angle. We talked a little bit about the wave number before, this K. And so here's Snell's law, relates the angle of incidence to the angle of transmission or refraction. And what we see is that because of the magnitude of the conductivity and epsilon naught permittivity of free space, that a plane wave coming in basically just refracts straight down. So even if the guy's coming in like 89 degrees, so this is wavefront surface, by the time it hits here, it just goes straight down. So very often people talk about magnetotellurics. They say, oh, there's a vertically propagating plane wave. Well, that's kind of the reason why you can get rid of that. Okay, but it's a plane wave, right? We know all about plane waves. We talked about that this morning. Butt melting is the skin depth by this. So high frequencies don't travel in as far as low frequencies. So as long as we've got a spectrum of frequencies, you can see how we could sample different depths of the Earth. So controlled source versus natural source, what's the difference? The big difference is that in controlled source, we know everything. We know the geometry, we know where we put the loop out, we know where we put the wires, got all those things. And yeah, we know everything about the system. Go to natural sources, however, a big problem is we don't know what the sources are. They're random in space, right? A lightning strike over there, one over there. Are they random in time? And so I just get this mishmash of signal. So that's the big issue. The good news is that Maxwell's equations, the electric and the magnetic field, depend in the same way on whatever source we have. What that allows us to do is to effectively take a ratio of fields and kind of get rid of the source term. It's a little bit more involved than that. What we end up doing is making what are called transfer functions. So transfer functions really codify a relationship between one field and another field. So in this case here, we've got the horizontal electric or magnetic fields at a particular point, and the horizontal electric fields are kind of related to those with some called impedance matrix or impedance tensor. So this is a 2x2 tensor, and it tells you how the electric field in the x direction depends upon hx and hy at this point, and vectors. So inside of this is all the information about the electrical conductivity structure here. Okay, so those are impedance functions. When you do a station, the things that you're going to record are both the electric and the magnetic fields, and then there's usually a remote station someplace that's ultimately going to be used to help get rid of noise. There's a couple things here that are important and also kind of relate a little bit back to what we talked about before. But there's two modes in which electromagnetic energy can travel or impinge. And one is called the TE mode, which is transverse electric. What I mean by that is that the electric field is parallel to an interface, and magnetic field is perpendicular to it. The TM mode, however, is one in which the magnetic field is parallel and the electric field crosses the boundary. So those are two ways. So you got a plane wave coming in, right? So you could have an electric field in this direction and magnetic field in that, or vice versa. And then as it's pinging on the table here or something, what's really critical is whether the electric field is crossing that boundary or whether it's parallel to it. And you can imagine why it's important when it's crossing the boundary, because we've already done that this morning in DC resistivity with respect to an electric field crossing the boundary, currents crossing that. Maybe there's charges that are built up. So if we have a homogeneous half space, then our impedance is given by ZXY. It's just EX upon PY. The resistivity comes from this formula here. So here's our relationship. So you measure that ratio of EX to HY, and that could be converted to a resistivity. So that's our way of getting back to the resistivity here. And then there's a phase. So now we could imagine doing a sounding, right? So remember I talked about different frequencies. So we could do a sounding. So here's what would happen if we had a resistivity Earth, 100 ohm meters over 10 over 500. Then I could use different frequencies. So what we're plotting on here is frequency. You can't read it, but this is the high frequency here. And the reason for that is that high frequencies have really small skin depth, and that means that we're kind of looking close to the surface of the Earth. As I go down in frequency, then I'm seeing deeper. So the apparent resistivity curve here is right here is 100 ohm meters, and that's coincident with that. And then it drops down. It's not quite 10, but that's usually how these things work. And then it goes back up to close to 500. So this apparent resistivity curve and that geologic model kind of makes some sense. So we have an app. There's a 1D app that actually allows you to experiment with not only conductivity, but magnetic permeability and electrical permittivity. Just to see how the fields go and what apparent resistivities and phases would look like. So what happens if we have a sounding now in 2D? So now imagine we got two blocks, one that's 100 ohm meters, one that's 10 ohm meters. And now we're going to do a traverse along this direction and ask ourselves, well, what are we going to see? Well, the electric field is always constant in that direction, so the electric field looks like that. And the magnetic field is smoothly varying like this, so that the apparent resistivity does something really quite nice. Over here, it's 100 ohm meters, and over here, it's 10. So that's kind of a nice apparent resistivity curve. And that is what happens when we take the ratio of sort of EY to HX. So that's kind of like the TE mode. Okay? So now what we're going to do is just go the other way so that we look at the electric field in this direction and the magnetic field here. So that's going to be the TM mode. And here's what you have. So as the electric field crosses that boundary, okay, remember we have to keep the current density constant. So if the current density is constant, that means the electric field needs to change. So there's charge buildup on that boundary, and we have an electric field that looks like this, and the apparent resistivity looks like that. So it's asymptotically, it's fine. It's got this kind of crazy overshoot in there, but that's what you get out. Let's see. So when you go to 3D. Again, no special symmetry, no special conditions. You just got to work in 3D. Just maybe make a comment about the data measurement, just to kind of give you at least an idea of what's going on here. So here's your problem. You're sitting at some point and you're just measuring some time series, right? But now some information is coming from you, some from you, some from you. I mean, it's just like this mishmash of stuff that's coming in. And really you would like to separate it all out. So at each station you measure these time series. And you can also measure a remote magnetic field. You somehow think that since you're looking for an impedance that is just something to do with frequency, you just take your time series, do a Fourier analysis, and you're good to go. That doesn't work because we've got many different events that are coming in. So the way to handle that is to take your time series, just divide it up into a whole bunch of small segments, and do Fourier transforms on each of these small segments to get frequency, and do some averaging over all these windows, so that you're kind of looking at stochastic, like on average, this is the relationship between EX and HY. These are those impedance tests. Inverting data, again, nothing really different compared to inverting control source, except that we don't really know necessarily what the boundary conditions are. Because we've got this great big Earth, right? Honestly, I could have an ocean sitting out there and a big conductor that's channeling currents in here, and that could screw things up a bit. So you need to be cognizant of that. But aside from that, kind of good to go. So what I'd like to do is to kind of quickly do one case history, and then we'll break for coffee. This is a magnetotelluric case history for a geothermal deposit. It's in Iceland. Iceland, as you know, it sits on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, right? So the plates are pulling apart, and there's a lot of magma that's coming up, and a lot of geothermal vents that are happening. Lots of hot springs, so it's a good place to go visit. And it supplies a major amount of Iceland's power. So what are we actually looking for? What's our physical properties and our setup? So the basic story with this is that, first of all, you've got a high temperature source that's coming in. So you've got some great big magma chamber. In this case, the plates are pulling apart. And you've got this high concentration of heat. Then we got water that's coming down from the top and sort of circulating around. And then there's an alteration zone that's going to happen here. It's going to generate something called spectite. It's a clay. It's very conductive, and it's kind of sitting in like this. Up until recently, I think the thing that people were primarily looking for was this kind of situation where you had a near-surface resistor, and you had a conductor, and then a resistive region, and then a deep conductor. So almost like a 4-layer model. And what they're interested in is what the base of this conductive layer is, because there's nothing going to happen right in the clay zone, but beneath here there might be something. A refinement on that is that we can have additional water circulation that's working in like this, and that will actually reduce the electrical resistivity. So the end result is that for this study, the goal was to find this resistive core, but actually to find regions within that resistive core that had a lower resistivity. Okay, so kind of looking for this lower resistivity within the kind of host resistive core. So there was 133 stations, so you measure EX, EY, and the three components of B. And here's what the field equipment looks like. So these are coils for magnetic coils to measure the three components of B. And then here's your electrodes for your potentials. And yes, 133 stations. So it's a very wide band. Look at that. So 300 hertz to 0.001 hertz. So it's almost, well, 5 orders or 5 decades of frequency that are used here. And then there's a road station, like 40 kilometers away. So there's a whole bunch of stations. I'm just going to concentrate on a few of them in this small corridor here. In particular, 2. Here's station 1. So what we see here, the blue are the X, Y, so it's kind of like EX over HY, and the red are the Y. Oh, sorry. Yeah, the other way around. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So red is one direction, blue is the other direction. And what we see up here in this first station, so again, this is frequency, high frequency here. So this is near the surface of the Earth. And we see that both the blue and the red, they're basically lying on top of each other, which means nothing is changing with orientation, which means like, okay, we're 1D. So this is 1D and it's resistive. And then as we go to lower frequencies, we see deeper. And notice a couple things. So these curves split like this, but they both have that kind of character. We start resistive, conductive, resistive, conductive, resistive. So you can almost kind of count the number of major layers that are there. Okay, so that's location 1. If we go to location 3, we find things are really different. So there we're at 10 to 2. Here we're dropped down an order of magnitude in resistivity, as well as the fact that the red and the blue are already separated. So something's happening as we and then, but it's still kind of going resistive, conductive, resistive, conductive, resistive. So it's still kind of the same sort of overall structure, but the other thing, this low resistivity, there's surface alteration, there's hot water and fumaroles. So definitely things are changing between 1 and 3. Okay, but essentially, like you just take the data, plot them up in that way, and you can start to see that things are happening. So now we take those 133 stations, and this was actually work that was done primarily by my graduate student, Gudni Rosenkar, in conjunction with Icelandic Geological Survey, as well as MIT. And the result was, again, you get a cube, all these different frequencies, and you try to find something that fits them. So here's a final conductivity model. This is an interesting image. So it's like a 3D. It's like somebody took a cross section out of a 3D conductivity model that looks like this, and then the rest of it's been kind of volume rendered to produce this region of high resistivity. So that's that resistive core. So what we see here is kind of like this ring resistive core, and then superimposed on it. If you just did a cross section, just along this way, then we've got something at the top is kind of resistive. There's conductor in here, and then there's quite resistive, conductive, and then there's a couple of areas that have lower resistivity. So we can actually put all that together in the following manner. This high conductivity up here is actually the clay layer. So that's that clay cap, that's that smectite clay. Big conductor down here, well, big red is the conductive. There's this dark blue here, it's all part of that resistive core. So here's the clay, here's the core, here's the heat source. And then you got these regions up here that have lower resistivity, and those are interpreted to be the reservoir. So one can actually do a lot of drilling, and they did. And so they drilled, what we're actually looking at here are temperature logs. So they're color coded to be temperature. And the high temperatures are seen here in these purple ones here. So, and that is in fact where the hot water system is. So there's one here, and there's one there. So what this did is kind of delineate two main production fields, and the deep source as a conductor. So it kind of looks as a really nice example for the use of modern MT as well as inversion. And that is probably a good place to leave it for coffee. So while we have coffee, then I'll have a group photo. Where do you think we should do the group photo? Outside someplace? Or?
Yeah, I think that might be better than to bring up all the lights.
Let's do it outside. There's yeah. I think maybe I kind of did wipe me out of it. It's interesting.
I have definitely some process.
Oh, you like my photos, so I did. All right, okay, well, that's good. I'm not sure. Okay, I'm going to.
Get some coffee?
Yeah.
I suggest that we went out for dinner tomorrow night.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Does that sound cheap?
Yeah, that sounds good.
What,
Yeah, we'll probably be.
which one did you go to?
Oh,
Did you go to it?
No, well, we went to.
So it's going to take the same.
No. We ate someplace down on the waterfront.
Eller to.
Barry, you have to come for a group photo.
Oh,
You cannot avoid it.
thank you.
mic for a minute. Yes, sir.
So I'll,
So different from here to there.
I might do that right after. That's perfect. No, I'm.
I actually don't have them.
Very different.
Yeah.
So, weather is very easy. This summer.
I have the.
Yeah.
No.
So I'll just start talking.
So, yeah, that's the summer friends in the state. Okay.
Okay, we're gonna shift gears a little bit. There's a couple of things that we want to do, just sort of a bit of housekeeping. So we'd like to have an evaluation. So Lindsay's gonna hand out a form sometime between now and when you go. If you could fill that out, that would be greatly appreciated. Secondly, I'm going to interject it now, although I'll talk a bit about it later. There is another, we have Disc Lab coming up tomorrow. Disc Lab's a little bit of a different thing. It'll have a number of components. First of all, I can certainly talk more about things that we didn't talk about today, maybe things that are a bit more in depth or different. I mean, I'm completely open. We've got material generally in places that we've been to. There's always been some subject that was of particular interest, and we talk a little bit more about that. The main thing, an important thing, one of the main things, is that we want to extract from you your view of the problems that you're working on. So we'd very much appreciate anybody giving just a 5-minute presentation on, look, this is the problem that I'm working on, somehow connected with electromagnetics, and this is what I'd like to accomplish, or it's what I have accomplished. Very informal. If you have slides, that's great. If you just want to stand up in front of a chalkboard, that's okay too. We would like to capture that on video and also post your slides if you're willing. If you're not, that's also fine. We're completely flexible, but as we go around the world, just our ability to capture these has been really useful. And if you go back and you look at our blog and you see all of the things that people are doing in the other stops, I hope that will also motivate you to participate, because the more people that participate, the greater the resource is. The other things that will be happening tomorrow, give you an overview of SimPeg, that's the Python simulation and version package that is being developed, part of an open source framework. We're also in talks with people who've been working on PyGimli, if you've heard of that, just trying to join forces to generate open source material so that, especially graduate students, when they're starting off on a research project, can actually get up to speed much faster than they would if they have to develop all the stuff themselves. Because right now, certainly my feeling with people in my group who start graduate studies is that they spend far too long rediscovering wheels that have been found many times before, and it's just taking them much longer. So the availability of open source material and having a framework in which to interact and work can greatly accelerate things and actually make it more efficient and more enjoyable and more fun. So Lindsay will talk about SimPeg, and then we've shown you apps, but they're all based on Python. You might actually be interested in how would we actually program? What's under the hood in these guys? I mean, how do they actually work? And then we have a number of tutorials on forward modeling and inversion, how to take Maxwell's equations in 1D and discretize them, things that might be of interest to people. So from what's happened in previous sites, certainly a lot of the graduate students and anybody who's doing research have benefited from the whole day. But people who are not very much interested in programming or things like that, to at least come the first part of the day to kind of pick up on material that we haven't managed to cover here, and also to contribute your project. That has been so interesting. And all kinds of people have come out of the woodwork. There was a guy in Australia who never heard about before, and he started talking about all the things that he was doing for agriculture and estimating really near surface conductivities. And he was putting together, gigantic loops, and he had all the basics done. He had transmitters and receivers, and he was pulling all this stuff in a cart behind a truck, and he was actually getting good images though, right? It was just kind of cool to see that and to be able to see what he's been able to do and what kind of problems he was up against. So we just see that whole spectrum. So I invite everybody to come tomorrow. It would be nice at this point, and it's actually important for the size of room that we get as to how many people would come. So let me ask two questions. First of all, who would be able or willing, and who would come tomorrow for the second day?
Keep hands up.
Way hands up.
Okay. 13.
It'd be at 9. 9, guaranteed. No 8 o'clock SCG. Yes?
14.
Oh. And of those people who raised their hands, who would be willing to give a 5-minute lightning talk on just what you're doing? Okay, that's fine. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4. Maybe. It's never too late to raise your hand. You can do that later during the day too. Take a look at our blog.
Do you want me to show what that is?
Oh yeah.
So tomorrow will be, because we had a big auditorium reserved, but that was why I would like to hear the number, how many is actually coming. So we'll be in the canteen in our building, which is 1120. I will send, there is a few who doesn't know where that is, so I'll let you know. But it's called building 1120 in the University Park. So this is building 1675, and we'll be in building 1120. Top floor.
The website you can go to find out what's happening in other locations, as well as to access all of the slides and course material from today. you go to GeoSci.xyz, there's this disk button, so you can follow that. And then from there, you can go to the schedule, and that'll have all of the links for the Aarhus day. And then the blog is right here. And so you can take a look there and see, there's a few presentation highlights that we have, just talking a little bit about each of the different presentations. And then there's also location-specific blogs where you can go in and have a look, see what happened that day. There's a bit of a summary of both day 1 and day 2, as well as the highlights of what people have presented in different locations. So that can give you an idea of
All right, excellent. How many people here have been involved somehow in either a GPR survey or interpreting GPR data or somehow making use of it? Oh, not very, okay. So we're going to change gears just a little bit. So what's our motivation here? Again, scale is a big issue, right? So we did natural source EM because we had big scales, and now we've got maybe smaller scales. So we've got maybe sinkholes, could be saltwater intrusion, underground, a lot of geotechnical work, engineering, finding tanks and wires, archaeology, or in the case that we were just at in Switzerland, it was actually using airborne GPR for rock placers. So it's probably worthwhile just kind of going through, just quickly go through the basics, just enough to kind of get you grounded in this. And then there's a couple of things I definitely want to show you. This example of the use of GPR for driverless vehicles. It's kind of cool. So what is GPR experiment? For people who are familiar with seismic, a lot of what I'll show you looks pretty similar to that. We've got a transmitter and receiver, got energy that's going down, reflects back up, and you get an image of reflections. It's just that what you're looking at here is not acoustic impedance, but you're actually looking at electrical permittivity. So we come back to Maxwell's equations. Now we have the Maxwell's equations like this. Now we're in our full form. This guy here, which we had neglected before, now gets into the equations and becomes fairly important, and in fact can be dominant. We saw this before. We had 2 first-order equations. We can combine them into 1 second-order equation. And importantly, there's this quantity here, which actually is a wave propagation term. And we can generate Helmholtz's equation in frequency domain. The quantity of interest is the electrical permittivity. We usually do a ratio of the electrical permittivity of something divided by the permittivity of free air, and that gives us epsilon r, which varies between 1 and 80. So air is 1, water is 80, and it doesn't matter whether it's fresh water or salt water. Things like ice have a very low dielectric constant, and all the other rocks are kind of in between. Maybe one of the most interesting things or important things is that what we're going to see are pulses, waves that sort of travel through the medium, but they're going to be traveling at a velocity that's the speed of light divided by the square root of epsilon. So if somebody's got a dielectric constant of 25, then it's going to be traveling at the velocity of light, 3 times 10 meters per second, divided by 5. We talked about skin depth and attenuation. The same thing happens in here. This is a frequency spectrum. So here we're at 10 to the 5th to 10 to the 10th. That's pretty high frequencies. Operating in here in our quasi-static regime is really basically up here and all the way to the left. So 1 hertz, 10,000 hertz. That's all in that quasi-static regime. In which case the skin depth is governed by that formula. If we continue to increase in frequency, then up here the skin depth is governed by this quantity here. So sigma is still playing a role, but it's a slightly different formula. So here's skin depth as a function of frequency. The app that we had provided, which was the electric dipole in a hole space, can be cranked up to whatever frequency you like, and you start to see the complexity of the electromagnetic waves as a function of frequency. So here's an electric dipole, and this is 10 to the 5th hertz. So you can see this is going out here. Here's a reversal, kind of going like that. And if you go to 10 to 6 hertz, so a megahertz, now you start to see the complexity of that electric field that's going through. And you can actually, just on the screen, kind of look at, okay, what's the wavelength between up, down, up again, and you'd find that this relationship So when we're talking about GPR signals, here's a short movie someplace. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to have an impulse that goes in here. And we're going to time step through, so you're actually going to see wave fronts. And those wave fronts are going to go, they're interacting with the boundaries. And if we draw the ray paths, which are the normals to the wave fronts, then we'll be able to see that there's energy that's traveling in the air. There's energy that's traveling right along the surface. There's some reflections, and there's a critical refraction that's coming in here. But unlike seismic, it's refracted at the surface. So it goes down, bounces up, refracts along. So there's some things to look for. So you can see it's gone up, and now we're just about ready to hit that boundary. Now we've got a reflection. That's coming at the surface, and now you can see that refracted wave at the surface and coming through. So that's our that's what's happening, and you've got these different waves. So this is that direct wave front in here. Here's this guy coming along here, and here's our reflections. So that's the basic experiment. We're putting off an electromagnetic pulse, and it's traveling. And honestly, if you saw those wave fronts, it could be almost anything, but they're all just traveling at different speed. Okay. So how do you get some information out of this? Well, the thing is, you're working at frequencies that are very high. So you're working at maybe 100 megahertz or a gigahertz. So even if you're pulling an instrument along in a very small fraction of a second, let's say a millisecond, you can actually get many records that are done just by sending off this pulse continually. So when you get it back, it turns out that there's not really very much distinct reflections. But if you start to stack, and you're just adding up multiples of these guys, so here's 5 stacks, here's 20 stacks, then you start to pull out the signal from the noise. So just the same as any kind of stacking. That gives you your signal, and then because you've got a lot of geometric fall off, then you apply some kind of a gain filter, and you end up with something like that. So people that have done seismic, that'll look really familiar to them. And this is what the end result looks like. It's often called a radargram. And you can see that there's there's a flat line event here, and then there's a hyperbola. So how do you get a hyperbola? That's what this movie is going to show. So as we're sitting here, there's going to be reflections from there, and you can just watch the wavefronts come through here. There's your initial wavefront, homogeneous medium. That's going to hit this target. Interact. So there's your reflection. Yeah, if you're sitting at a particular point out here where you had your transmitter and your receiver, it would take you a certain length of time for that wave to travel outwards and back. If you're sitting over here, it's taking less time. So that means that as you're pulling an instrument over top here, you're going to end up with a reflection that looks like that. And the slope of that line is actually related to the velocity of the medium. So from the point of view of interpretation, it's really a whole bunch more simple than all the stuff that we've been doing up to now. Although, granted, these days the future of that research is at full wavefront reconstruction, so people are using the whole wave field. But honestly, most of the information is just obtained by looking at the data. So you just get a data map, and here's a map of the data over some tanks. So you got the tanks sitting at the top, so that localizes it, right? So there's the horizontal location, and then you got a depth. So you need to get a velocity, but once you've got a velocity, then you can transform your time section to a depth section, and here this guy is at probably about 4 feet deep. And there's other things that come along here. So there's these events in here. Those are the tank beds. So when they put a tank in, they've got a little bed, put the tank on, and you actually see that information coming out of the radar ground. Radar systems, they can be shielded or not. Most of them are, at the higher frequencies, are all just in a single container. Some of them can be moved on a cart. Here's a guy, he's an engineer, he's just looking for cables. I mean, he's got a little template just running across here, and then sees the image on here. Sometimes they're separate, the transmitter and receiver, they're both just antennas, they're just kind of electrical wires that are sticking out. And then you can do various things with them. You could acquire them in a common midpoint format. So you've got transmitter, receiver, dot, 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 right? Or common offset where you're just pulling things along. So that's kind of the essence of things. Actually, at this level, considerably more simple and intuitive than all the electromagnetics that we were working with. Here's some uses. Here's an environmental test survey. This was actually done at UBC where I'm from. There's a little aquifer that's in here, and we're trying to kind of characterize what was happening. So it ran a line across here, and here was the radar cross section. So I show you this for a couple of reasons. One is that you see some flat line structures. The other is that you notice that there's a kind of a washout here, right? We only see down a certain depth. And the question, why is that? It's because the radar signals attenuate as they go through anything that's conductive. So that's the curse of GPR. And probably one of the reasons that it's not maybe used very much in Denmark because of the high conductivity at the near surface, but that really limits the penetration. What we did here was to go with a DC resistivity survey across here, and here was the resultant conductivity image. So you can see it's really conductive over here, and it's more resistive over here. So this conductive part here is just attenuating those signals. So GPR is great, but it doesn't penetrate through conducting materials very easily. Well, here was that example of the underground storage tanks so you can see them. And then you can do sort of profiles at arbitrary depth slices and just get different images out. So again, that's not inverted. That's just images of the data and looking at the amplitudes of the data. Mapping peat thickness. This is in Ireland. Guys towing a GPR system over a hill, and then the GPR radar section looks like this. So you can get an estimate of what the thickness of the peat is. It's kind of interesting because you can get a reflection, electromagnetic reflection, either from a change of the dielectric constant, epsilon, or conductivity. So in this case, there was both an iron pipe and PCV pipe. So the iron pipe was carrying water and the PCV was carrying gas. And these were two different depths. The natural gas main up here at 1 meter is imaged, and at 1.4 meters, the water line is imaged. You got reflections from plastics, reflections from conductors. So GPR, as long as you can see down to that depth, has some ability to help interpret the problem. Here's another application we were involved in. This too, it's a potash mine in Canada, in Saskatchewan, and there the big thing is water. So remember, water had this really high electrical or dielectric constant. That means that you get a strong reflection from it. And now, of course, you're worried about water coming in from the ceiling. So you have to do the experiment where you put the GPR system up on the ceiling, right? And now you're walking along like that. And then you're looking for reflections and trying to see where the water is. This I won't go through, but I'll tell you the gist of it and why I think it's interesting. This case history is interesting for two reasons. So basically, the background is that in various places in the world, certainly in Canada and also in places like Switzerland and Austria, there are kind of what are called rock glaciers, just combination of ice and rock, and the whole thing can kind of slip down, and if it does, it can cause damage. And what you really want to do is to find that. They went into the field and for a number of years did GPR surveys just right on the ground. But that was okay. They got lots of reflectors, but they actually were so close to things, and there's so much going on that they couldn't discriminate. They couldn't figure out what was happening. There's just stuff all over the place. However, if you sometimes sacrifice resolution, which is what you have if you're really up close, and you sacrifice a bit of that, you actually can see a certain scale size more clearly. So it's kind of like the idea of trying to just, distinguish, okay, what am I looking at? What do I look like now? That's not very interesting. What does Sarah look like, right? So you just, like, if I'm looking too close, I'm just seeing too much detail and I can't kind of recognize the whole thing. But if I step back, then I'm losing that resolution, but now the large scale comes into focus. And that's actually what happened here. So when they were down on the ground, where you think, okay, I want to be as close as possible, get my best resolution, you just got so much stuff coming in, you couldn't make any sense of it. But then when they went up in the air in a helicopter, they were suddenly able to get more information. And that actually led them to a whole new, well, tectonic model for ice glaciers, how they formed and how they but I am going to show you.
So this is something which I did not discover until just about a week or so before we left here. It's called localizing GPR for driverless vehicles. It's all done with MIT Lincoln Labs in conjunction with a GPR company, GeoSci. And the issue here is really looking at driverless cars and the amount of information and what information they have that comes in. So a typical driverless car, this is a little bit of an old vintage, has got a lot of sensors on it, right? And most of them are optical. You know, they're looking for, you got cameras mounted every place, you got GPS, you got LiDAR, and you know, just trying to collect all that data, trying to figure out, okay, where is my car based upon all of these pieces of information. So it actually works pretty well in fine weather, but when you've got any kind of an optical sensor, things can become difficult if the situation changes. So if you have bad weather, you know, got rain, snow, fog, sleet, whatever, or if you've got some changes in the upper structure, road signs have changed, or somebody repainted the stripes or something, or vegetation, all those things could, you know, deteriorate your ability to locate where you are. So there's always a need for additional sensor data. So here's the ticket. So you're going to use GPR. So what you're going to do, take a GPR unit and mount it under the truck. Okay? So there's actually going to be a whole bunch of little GPR systems in your transmitters, receivers that are kind of mounted in here. And then at any particular time, if you had set these off, you get a radiogram that comes back for that location. So the idea is kind of like this. So here's our GPR antenna, and you know, it's putting information into the ground, and you'd go out and collect data, let's say on a clear day. So the idea is it's kind of like a big project, right? You're trying to think about, okay, mapping all of the road systems with GPR data, and you're going to store that as a reference data set. Yeah, that's, I mean, but you know, on the other hand, you think of even now, I mean, Google, right, with, you know, location, with GPS, I mean, they're conversing with tens of millions of people at a time, you know, locating where you are really shortly, right?
Yeah,
so,
but your GPR, when someone pulls up next to you, your GPR is going to go crazy because it's going to pick up a big metal car.
yeah, I don't know just how sensitive
we had some guys who did some work and they forgot to move the Jeep every time they did the GPR. And so
oh, yeah.
all they saw was the Jeep. So they were driving along and they picked up the Jeep because the Jeep's a big metal.
Yeah, yeah.
And they weren't the same distance from the Jeeps. They didn't spot the mistake until someone else looked at it.
Well, that's interesting. I'm sure with all these technologies,
maybe they've done something.
there's stuff that is going to happen. But in what I'm going to show you, they basically do the following. So they come over, they collect a reference data set. So that's then stored. And then you're going to come over, drive over this again, collect another data set, and then you want to cross-reference that data set with this and find out where you are. So basically, it's a cross-correlation, maximizing cross-correlation. So that's essentially how you come along, you collect another set of data, you kind of cross-reference it with the reference data set, and in the paper that I read, they were doing kind of like particle swarm types of things and ending up like, okay, here's where I'm at. Okay. So that's the basic idea. It's just that you got to kind of up your game a little bit because, as you're going to see in this next movie, you're trying to get basically 4 centimeter accuracy of your vehicle at 60 miles an hour in poor conditions. So that sounds
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sorry, maybe I just don't understand it. Is it based on that the underground has a unique fingerprint that can tell you
Exactly.
where you are instead of GPS?
Yeah. well,
Yeah.
Or
So
like-
every
like
as you
GPS.
come through the every it's got some kind of a GPR fingerprint.
Yeah.
Right. So it looks like this. It looks like that. Looks like that.
So at Cornell, we had a one-on-one class for GPR, and we shot, so we did it every semester.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on the local weather, GPR signal was different. So it was done like 3 times a year for 3 classes, and we never got the same signal 3 times in exactly the same place. Because they put salt out on the pavements.
Yeah, salt
And the temperature and the
Yeah.
water table moved and the temperature changed. So I'm skeptical.
Well, I think it's good.
I wouldn't want to be in the, I want other things other than that.
Well, I think that's the issue, right? It's not that you,
Salt in Massachusetts.
it's not that you're going to rely on this. It's another piece of information. And especially when other pieces of information become less reliable, then maybe this kicks in. I mean, it's just like geophysics, right? There's no panacea, right? You need a whole bunch of different. Is the speakers going to work here?
Probably.
Maybe.
And I'm going to, this is going to be part of my life. And how is it working? Well, it's actually making use of information, some kind of crazy sensor that's putting energy into the ground, and I'm getting information about the subsurface, and it's helping me. That, I think, is a real pivotal thing. It's something that just kind of torques, has the potential for kind of torquing somebody's mind around and saying like, oh, well, maybe, there is something about, looking into the ground, getting images, and making use of them. Once you open up that tab, then the idea of, doing geophysical kinds of surveys for, other scales of what's in the ground or other things, like it's not so hard because they're already kind of half connected. So I think there's something there that is an extra just for very talks. Actually, the other thing, kind of sort of, that I really like, as scientists, we're always involved in, trying to convey information about our numerical modeling and uncertainty, to the public. And when you have, things like climate change, okay? Whether okay, do you believe in climate change? Do you think that these results from these scientists are, valid or not valid? Then the people who are skeptical will go about and look for places where, like the models disagree or something, and they can just make a big thing of like, well, one is saying this and the other is saying this, and so how could you believe them, right? And to some extent, there's some validity there, but I'm not sure if people really followed all these disastrous hurricanes that were going about in the U.S. Very interesting to watch the television commentators talk about the development of the new system. After Harvey went through, then the new system was Irma coming in. And so they were talking about where this thing might go. And then they'd show lines like, okay, so Irma is currently over here, right? And then there's modeling that's done from the European group, and that was projecting a trajectory toward Florida and then up the coast. And then there's another line that goes more or less that same thing up the coast. More or less the same thing up the coast. Those were all from the European models, and there was definitely differences in trajectory, and there was clearly some uncertainties, but that's where they were going. Then the American models come in. They all start at the same place, and for the first line actually kind of comes through, agrees with the Europeans, but then continues to go straight through. In other words, they kind of bifurcate at some point. And so then you've got this band of the American model that's coming through. So lots of variability, but kind of a band. And then you've got the band with the European model that comes through. In the first few days from the prediction, the European and the American models actually agree. But at some point, they disagree. And that first part where they agree, actually, out to be pretty close to what was on. And then you could see as the days went in, it was always that same kind of thing, except that as the days went in, the US model kind of went up and the European model kind of went down this way. And then eventually they were smacked together and then putting things up through Central Florida. So if you think about that from a subliminal presentation, it's kind of powerful because what it does is it shows you in relationship to something that you really understand, like where is this hurricane going? You know, kind of the variability of scientific models, and also, you know, that where models are agreeing seems to be pretty close to an eventual outcome. So now if you look at climate prediction, and you know, what are all of the models saying? They're saying, well, you know, the extremes are going to get more extreme, right? The hot weather is going to get hotter. The dry is going to get drier. The wet is going to get wetter, right? Everything is fluctuating. The storms that we used to have on a 100-year scale, we're going to have on a 10-year scale or a 5-year scale. So all, you know, virtually all the models are kind of migrating towards that. And I think that what we saw with the hurricane prediction, and then maybe kind of couple them, starts to, I don't know, just starts to help the public understand that, you know, at some scale you can kind of, you know, have more trust in these predictions that are generated by a whole bunch of different groups, a whole bunch of numerical models. And it's just kind of subtle, but works its way in. I think it's ultimately potentially important.
So were there any hurricane deniers?
Yes, of course, but Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh claimed that there was no hurricane, it was all scam until he evacuated. Because he had a house in Knox County. He said it wasn't happening, it was all until he showed up and then he left.
Right.
So they actually do exist.
Yeah. No.
Okay, we've got one last topic. Induced polarization. This is something that the Aarhus group here has been doing a lot of. And yeah, I'm actually looking forward to conversations tomorrow to talk more about this. I noticed you had a whole bunch of posters outside about IP. So I think that's great. I'm going to start kind of at the beginning on this, but just sort of give a quick overview, and then we can pick some of this up tomorrow too, especially for yeah, looking at the integration of EM and IP. So what's the motivation? Well, the big motivation is that when you measure the resistivity of a rock, okay, you basically clamp it in and you put a current through this rock. You establish a voltage, and there's a current that goes through, and you look at that relationship between the voltage and the current, and you might find that they're actually shifted in phase a little bit, and that the absolute value it changes as a function of frequency. So this is really low frequencies, 10 to minus 3. This is high, 10 to 6. And at very low frequencies, the rock appears to be very resistive, and at high frequencies, it tends to be much less resistive. And then there's a phase shift that can be translated into an imaginary part or quadrature part that looks something like this. So what that means is that you can't talk about a single resistivity of a rock. It kind of depends upon at which frequency you're measuring things. This actually has implications, big implications in mineral exploration, also permafrost, groundwater. That was what a lot of the posters outside were involved in. C4 massive sulfides. Haven't talked about that, but that's something that will come in, right? And geotechnical work, especially when you're talking about hydrocarbons and solid waste. So these problems, there might be another level of information that could be gained. So what is IP or induced polarization? It's a microscopic phenomena that has a macroscopic effect. And just to kind of show, so if a material is not chargeable, and that's kind of what we're thinking about when we're doing the DC resistivity experiment, that we put in a current that looks like this, it's got an on time and off time. Then the electric potential that you measure also follows that same kind of square wave pattern. If the material is chargeable, then if you put in that same current pattern, the interesting thing happens is that immediately on turn on, the voltage rises, okay? But then as the current stays on, there's a continual rise in that voltage. And initially when they discovered this, and this was back in late 40s or right after the Second World War or thereabouts, that was called over voltage, because it was more voltage than they had expected to get out. Then when you turn it off, the same thing happens, it kind of drops down and then decays. As I said, it's a microscopic phenomena. There's a lot of things that are going on involving surface to areas of minerals, as well as how everything is connected. But there is that macroscopic representation. There's quite a few ways of trying to think physically about what causes this IP effect or what causes this chargeability. But the one that I think is perhaps really useful, and it does have a lot of well-based applications or processes, is something called membrane polarization. And here's how you can kind of think about it, and this is also how you can translate it into what was happening in those previous points. So initially, when we've got, so let's look at a really small scale. So this is just little pores inside a rock. So maybe there's clay particles here, and clay particles are negatively charged, and you've got some fixed charges on the outside. And initially, all this stuff is electrically neutral. There's a fluid in there, there's ions, and the whole thing is kind of electrically neutral. Now, suppose I put an electric field on here. So I apply a voltage, or I apply it like putting a battery in here. I've got an electric field. So what's going to happen? Well, this is the positive end. So positive charges are going to try to get repelled from here. They're going to try to go this way. Negative charges are going to go this way. And if there's a little bit of a restriction or something like that, then there's going to be a buildup of positive charges here and negative charges here. You just can't quite get through that pore. So at the end of the day, we've got a positive charge and a negative charge. So it's like an electric dipole. So that's where it's called polarization, electric polarization. What can be chargeable? Well, the minerals. Pyrite is one of the most chargeable materials around. Graphite also. Then material types, sulfides are very chargeable. Clays are quite chargeable. And then other things are kind of intermediate. So we can start to kind of understand, this is why this is, I think, kind of intuitive. So let's look at our input current, kind of goes like this, and then we're going to turn it off. So we're going to turn the current on, and the moment we do that, there's this electric field that's built up, so we've got an electric potential that's measured. But now, with continued application of that electric field, there's going to be this buildup of charges here. And so that is going to rise like this. And you can see, initially, the first set of charges would be pretty easy, and then gradually they build up in the asymptote because they have to quit at some point, because if you get so many positive charges in here, the next positive charge gets repelled from these as much as it gets repelled from this. Okay, so it's going to rise quickly, and then it's going to asymptote out. And then the moment that I turn it off, and initially I got it down drop, and now this decay here, that's just the charges going back to their natural equilibrium state. Okay, so I really like this kind of cartoon picture of things because it helps you make a direct relationship between what you can see physically here and a measurement that you could make. So what's the IP datum? Well, Siegel in 1959 introduced something called chargeability eta. And basically its effect is to reduce the electrical conductivity by a certain amount. So eta, theoretical, varies between 0 and 1. And if the material is chargeable with some particular value in here, then its effective conductivity is reduced. The theoretical estimate of chargeability from the voltages can be obtained by this onto here, taking the ratio of this secondary potential to this total potential. So that would give secondary potential or this guy. So, I mean, that's a theoretical representation, but unfortunately you can't measure that because I can't turn something off instantly and then measure what is going on there. Okay? That means you got to measure something else. That something else is really variable. In time domain, it's anything that's connected with that curve. Doesn't matter. It could be a value at a particular time. It could be an integration over some time window. Any of these things could be useful. And you notice they all have different units. If it was just this secondary voltage, you might just have that value or ratio of this divided by that, or some integration of this, which would just give you a time, a millisecond. So anything that's somehow connected with that, you're good to go. That's a valid IP data. In the frequency domain, there was something used to call PFE. People don't do that very much anymore, but here's one that is more frequently used. I have a source current, goes in like this, and then I measure a potential, looks like that, and this phase difference, so again, that keeps going back, the phase difference between these two things is a valid IP data. So that would be in milliradians. How do we work with this? Well, we saw that introducing chargeability is kind of like something that perturbs the electrical conductivity. So we could do a Taylor expansion and basically write an IP datum as equal to the product of some sensitivity matrix. That sensitivity matrix we're going to obtain from the DC resistivity problem times our sort of chargeability that we're working with, whether it's in milliseconds or milliradians. The bottom line is we can write this in that linear form. It's like a gravity problem or potential field problem. Do that. So just to summarize up, we can take a time domain datum, we can take frequency domain datum, doesn't matter. They have different units. We write them in this form, and then we're going to solve for eta, and eta is going to have the same dimensions as whatever this was. So it's milliradians or millivolts per volt, milliseconds, whatever. It's a pseudo-chargeability. So again, this is now going to be something that's very parallel to what we did first thing this morning, except that this is now a chargeable section. So this background has first of all, it has a uniform conductivity, and then this is a chargeable block in here. And now I do my DC experiment. So I mean, I can clearly acquire the IP datum at the same time as I do my DC, right? I mean, I'm just measuring it in my off time. So I'm going to do the same pole-dipole experiment. Here's my pseudo section. Again, no problem. If that's all I had, I'd probably drill here and I'd get it. But just the same as this morning, if I put little bits of clay and graphite or whatever up here, then my pseudo section looks like that. It's completely garbage. And here's my GIF model. So this is it's all the same conductivity. The only thing that changes is the chargeability. There's our pseudo section, and drill here means you missed the targets. So the IP inversion. So here's where the work that we've been doing for a couple of decades now differs somewhat from what you guys are doing. So we treat this problem as a two-stage problem rather than an all at once. So by two-stage, I mean the following. So we're going to collect the DC and the IP data together. And then the very first thing that we're going to do is invert these data to recover the electrical conductivity structure. Okay, so that gives us our conductivity. And then once we have that, that gives us our mapping for this. That gives us that sensitivity, J. So we use this to calculate J. And then now we're going to invert for chargeability to get that. So it's robust. It's two-stage. There's pros and cons to doing it a couple of ways, but this is good enough, certainly for today. So actually, the thing I like about this also, this I think was also one of the first 2D DCIP inversions that was done in the mineral industry, where we covered both the conductivity and the chargeability. This was for the Century deposit in Australia. And it's kind of interesting here. So here's conductivity, or the resistivity. And you see this blue up here. So that's resistive. There's some faults in here. And then there's mineralized zones in here. So the resistivity does not tell you anything about the things that you're looking for, which is this mineralization here. The chargeability, however, does. So you take this conductivity model and sensitivity invert here, and now look what you've got. Now you've got high chargeabilities that are kind of coinciding with this guy, and maybe even kind of seeing faults. So in some ways, chargeability can almost act as kind of another physical property and be diagnostic. And in fact, that's what we'll see in the case history. So let's look at our buried prism. So here's our chargeable prism, and here's the recovered chargeability. So that looks good. Ones with the noise, again, we recover this guy, and we see some manifestations of this noise up here. And in the GIF model, we start with this, and we find two chargeable bodies. So that looks pretty good. Okay, so that's the background. So it's very related to the DC resistivity. They're all done at the same time. Just collect data in the off time and then see what you can do with it. So now I want to go back to this case history that we started with, which was the Mount Isa. So here was our hook. So it was at in Australia, up here at the top. I'm going to change the setup question. This morning when we were doing DC resistivity, I was asking, okay, can we find a conductive unit that would be diagnostic? Now we're actually going to change that. We're going to change, can we find a conductive chargeable unit that would be a potential target? And here's our table. Here's our physical property table. Remember, in conductivity, the thing we were looking at was Mount Noblet Horizon, which had a high conductivity. It distinguished itself from everybody else except for this breakaway shale, which had a very high conductivity. So that was the big geologic unit. If you look at chargeability, however, the Mount Noblet Horizon is really the only one that really has high chargeability. So even the breakaway shale's got kind of low to none, and other things are low. So now we got a fighting chance of working with both of these things and seeing what we can find. So just to remind you, this is from the DC resistivity. We collected the DC data. Here was our inverted model. So that's the black shale unit, and we did find some evidence of a a moderate conductor up here. So what did the IP data look like? Well, here's our pseudosections. So again, we got 20 pseudosections, both a pole-dipole and a dipole-pole. And you can see that there's some chargeable material. So red means chargeable, blue means not chargeable. Now we do the same thing, except it's two-step, right? So we first of all take the DC resistivity data, we invert them, we get that conductivity model. Take that conductivity model, transfer that, get the mapping function. So we get the J. And now we invert, as a linear inverse problem, the IP data. So what we're going to see, now we've got a cube. This is chargeability. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to slice the in, and we're going to slice down, and we're going to rotate around with different systems. So notice that big red stuff on the side. Now we have it. So we've got this big, large, chargeable unit in here. Maybe that's a more appealing section. That is coinciding with that high conductor in here and extends down this way. So here's our interpretation. For the resistivity model, we have this. And if I take this line here, D, noting that breakaway shale, put it on here, I up here. Remember it said the breakaway shale isn't expected to be chargeable? And so we basically see that. E is the highly conducting but chargeable unit, and that's traced along here. So that's our interpretation, and actually it comes out to be pretty well. That is the mineralized horizon that people are looking for. One aspect that was kind of interesting when we went to Australia, to Adelaide, we were presenting this, and it turned out that there was a couple of people that had been intimately involved. There was one guy who showed him this, and he said, "Oh yeah, I collected those data." And yeah, so we were asking him, how far things had gone, and he said, because we were kind of wondering about this guy, like it's chargeable, it's not super conductive, but he's kind of hiding in conductivity with the breakaway shale. Just couldn't, just didn't know what that guy was. And he said, they noticed that before, and it's still of interest to them. They're going to go back and drill it one of these days. So I thought, well, that's kind of nice. Anyway, so the bottom line is that we've got this guy. How you guys doing? You want to see something about landfills? Okay. How many people would have some sense that IP would actually be really good for finding old waste deposits and dumps? Well, we got 7. That's not bad. I know. Anders raised his hand the highest. I thought that was pretty cool. Okay, so I first of all just want to kind of go through maybe a little bit of global thing, and then we'll see about, we either do your case history today or we might do that one tomorrow. But the reason I'm going to show you these is just as kind of a sequence of slides. And it's all developed by Zong Geophysics. Zong resides in Tucson, so it's not surprising that they were involved in local problems. And here's what's happened commonly in the United States, especially, and maybe here, is that in 1950s, the aerial extent of Tucson, Arizona, so it's a city in southern United States, was governed by this kind of purple outline. So that's your city limits. You got some garbage. What do? Put it in a truck, haul it away, dump it out someplace. And these little stars here are places where they have basically dumped things in the past. If you look at the city limits right now, they kind of extend out here. So the city has grown around the garbage or waste dumps, and that causes some problems. There are health concerns, water contamination, it could be construction hazard, and for people who own that property, it really devalues their land if they've got some waste on it, right? So they're not going to be able to sell it very much. So the goals are then to locate these abandoned landfills, kind of assess the size, characterize the waste, and maybe do some reclamation and monitoring them. So when we talk about physical properties for wastes, you've got all kinds. You've got electronic, construction debris, earth materials, maybe just green waste. If you look at the resistivities, they can vary between these different things, between low to high to moderate to variable. In other words, resistivity is not a direct indicator or highly correlated necessarily with the existence of waste. On the other hand, chargeability actually seems to be much more strongly correlated with the existence of waste, and therefore it becomes a parameter that you might want to be very cognizant of. So what has traditionally been done? Well, use of magnetics, okay, because there's drums and stuff like that, steel. DC resistivity, traditionally used, or EM, either a frequency domain EM, EM61, or that EM31 frequency. So time domain, sorry, or frequency. So, limited success, not always, and there's a chance that IP might be more diagnostic. So here's just some examples. It's basically just examples with different sites. So this is mixed solid waste over this. So historical boundaries of the waste dump are this. If you look at the resistivity, kind of looks like that. It's nothing particularly descriptive. If you look at chargeability, however, it actually looks pretty good. Okay, so construction debris or demolition debris. So here now the resistivity actually is kind of correlating with the waste is high resistivity material. It's wallboard or whatever it is. The chargeability is like that. So there's kind of a nice correlation. Here's a landfill deposit. In fact, this one is very similar to your case history. So what's happened here is that there was probably more of a original topography like this, and you come along, you dump stuff, and you dump stuff, you dump, right? Then here's the waste deposit. And over top of here, if you kind of look at this, the material is really it's conductive. So the color scale that we're looking at here is resistivity. So red is low resistivity, so it's conductive. So that does make some sense. But the contours are chargeability. The chargeability is confined to this region up here. If you look at the resistivity, however, there's low resistivity here, which is fine. But there's a lot of low resistivity here. And this is the important item. This is very likely a leachate. So we've got waste here. There's leach, stuff is leached out through here. So you got leachate. Leachate turns out not to be chargeable. So it has a low resistivity and no chargeability, whereas the waste is both chargeable and low resistivity. So that's a nice kind of distinction. I've seen this kind of example in a number of places. Now, Carly Gallen has a nice one of this in Sweden, and that emulates the one by, is it GeoSci.xyz? GeoSci.xyz? How do you, sorry? How do you pronounce, is it GeoSci.xyz for the survey?
I don't know, she's French, so I wouldn't.
Oh, okay.
Maybe.
Anyway, so it's something that that is seen now and shows that IP and resistivity can be really go nicely together and help with the interpretation. It was interesting that even organic material has got some low chargeability associated with it, and the people in Bonn are kind of working on root systems and the chargeability of organic material. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Here's an example that's kind of an ideal fingerprint for municipal solid waste. So it's got low resistivity and it's chargeable. So that's probably the textbook fingerprint for things. And then this one's kind of interesting. This is effectively using IP for looking at the effectiveness of bioremediation. So what was done here was that there was a waste there. They had to go in and put drill holes in and blow air through it and do some sparging. And after 4 years, they came back and they did the IP again, and it was reduced to this. So that would seem to indicate that the IP is really kind of sensitive to what the state of bioremediation is of the landfill. And if this kind of turns out, then that might be a way of kind of monitoring how well a landfill is being cleaned. So in summary, resistivity is not necessarily a reliable indicator. You don't really know which way it's going to go, but chargeability does seem to be that. So I do have this case history. I think it's kind of late enough in the day that we'll postpone this till tomorrow if people are interested. And then I think what we'll do is just have some summary comments. Talk about the future. Okay. Okay, so what did we cover? Well, DC resistivity. That we looked at some fundamentals, frequency, time. We did some inductive source in the frequency domain. Did some inductive source in the time domain. We did some grounded sources for India. That was time domain. Natural sources, we had an example for Iceland. Ground penetrating radar, a few examples, and then this localized GPR. And induced polarization, back to the mineral deposit. So we've kind of touched on everything and seen that full spectrum of things. So the question is, okay, well, what does the future hold? So here we are. We're back to what we started with. We've got problems, high quality data, version capabilities, web tools to communicate, and we're trying to kind of attach those things all together with the disk. And as far as the future goes, there's just, especially as we've been traveling around, you just see more and more of the places where electromagnetics can play a role and where it actually needs to play a role. Because a lot of the things, that have been traditionally done by seismic or something else, as the requirement for looking nearer the surface becomes more prominent, you realize electromagnetics can play a role. And then because we're made such huge advances in the electromagnetic problem, you just realize that it really can play a role and it must. So we got monitoring, aquifers, enhanced oil recovery, hydraulic fracturing, CO2 sequestration, maybe coal seam gas. The whole point is that things are changing as a function of time, either because you're putting stuff in or you're drawing it out. And if there's an electromagnetic signature that's associated with that, then by monitoring this process, we should be able to find out what's going on. And here is an example for groundwater at Bruno. There's also a whole host of problems connected with numerical challenges. One of the things we talked about was trying to excite the body. So here's the case. So maybe this is CO2 sequestration, or maybe that's a bit of a hydrocarbon reserve in a field that's been kind of pumped out, and you want to discover what its state is, or if you can see it. If we just have a current, we put it on the surface, then it's really hard to ignite that body, right? But if we had an extended electrode, then now we could be funneling current really close to that body, and that might give us enough charges or currents in here that we could go ahead and measure things. So that's kind of the idea. Okay, so suppose you had that problem. How would you? What are you up against? Well, you're up against a lot of scale issues in a whole bunch of senses. First of all, in size, you've got a lot of issues, right? So here's the well, the drill stem, has maybe 10 centimeters in diameter, and it's got a wall that's maybe centimeter thick, and that's your pipe. And this pipe is extending down a couple of kilometers. Okay, so you got centimeters, you got kilometers, and you've got things that are tens or hundreds of meters. So that's a lot of different scales to work with, and that is exacerbated by the fact that the physical properties that you have in here is hugely different. So steel, 10 to the 6 Siemens per meter. The background conductivity here is maybe 1. Magnetic permeability of this thing is 50, a couple hundred. I mean, these are really challenging problems numerically. And you have to kind of figure out, okay, where's the currents going and what's happening. And then things can become more complicated, if you've got corrosion. So one of the things that we've provided you with is the code that Lindsay and others have put together, and that is the SIL code. So that can monitor or estimate what the currents are and what fields are in a cylindrically symmetric region like this, and even change the magnetic permeability. So it's a useful code that is actually a research code too, that might be extremely useful, and that is all open source. And then things become more complicated, especially as you try to go in and solve real life problems. You've got lots of infrastructure, and maybe your pad has got a whole bunch of wells that are kind of going out, and you just have to model everything, because certain things can give rise to a big perturbation. In other words, here's a case where inadvertently there was a wire that was going from here to some storage shed. Well, it goes over there, and you put a current onto here, hoping it's going to go down, and you find oh, wait a minute, I just lit this guy up, right? So you got to understand that success is going to be in the details, and sometimes little things can come out in left field and really, really do you in. The other thing is, you sometimes get in a situation, especially as electromagnetic geophysicists talking to non-specialists, like they'll just come out and say, well, can electromagnetics work? And can it solve this problem, right? And again, just like finding a tunnel, it's too broad a question. You can't answer that. So very often you have to ask different questions at different times in your whole survey to really understand what's going on and to make the best use of it. Here's one that I think is really interesting from several points of view, because it's an example that's starting to show, and certainly for the oil companies that we were dealing with, it was a little bit of an eye-opener for them as to, like, oh my gosh, electromagnetics actually might be really useful here. And the idea is that this is in heavy oil sands, where they use what's called steam-assisted gravity drainage. So you put two wells down, and they're horizontal, and through one of them you put steam in the upper chamber, and then that steam permeates the region, and the hydrocarbons become less viscous. They drop down, they're collected by this other well, and then they come back up. Okay? So what they really want to do is to extract this stuff, but at the same time they want to pump steam down, and they want to know where the steam is. Same as with any kind of hydraulic fracking. You're putting stuff down. Where is this stuff, right? So if you're going to set something like this up, you might need to have something that's kind of a reconnaissance, and you might need to want to do things a little better, find more information out about what's there, and then you might want to have some kind of a monitoring array. So there's different questions that would be asked at different levels of this proposal. From a reconnaissance point of view, this was pretty interesting. The geology was such that there is a particular unit here called the top of the McMurray that is of great interest to the oil companies, because the oil sands are underneath here. Okay, so you want to know where this boundary is. If you fly an airborne EM survey over here, and then go ahead and invert that and estimate that boundary level from the airborne EM results, you end up with an image that looks like this. Right? So this is elevation of that interface as a function of x and y. Right? The oil companies had was this one. So they actually did pretty the same, but this image is obtained from what was done here, which are all these are all boreholes. So each of these black dots is a borehole, penetrates this horizon, and then those are interpolated onto this grid. So as a first order, there is an awful lot of information obtained from a reconnaissance array using the airborne EM. If you're going to actually set all of this up and do injection and monitoring, you want to know the conductivity better. So you might start laying, in addition to the airborne, you might have a large surface loop. And then, especially in this case, you're required by law to have an observation well. You could easily instrument that with putting in vertical electric dipole receivers and use those as data with the surface loop and borehole receivers as data. So that would give you a better estimate of what that background conductivity is. And then you could do something like this. So this is a synthetic example, but it's kind of nice because what there's 3 horizontal wells that are drilled, okay? And each of them has had steam that goes through them. So these. And there's one of them that had a bit of a blocked steam chamber. So if you look in cross section, steam looks like this on these two guys, and here it's just a little. From the company perspective, what they're interested in is, okay, where is the steam? Basically, where's it gone? And is there any chance that you could find where things have been restricted? And so this is work done with 2 surface transmitters and borehole receivers of just the electric field in these observation wells. And the inversion results get something like this. So this is really, I don't know, I think encouraging as far as what electromagnetics can see. And the fact that this whole thing is up within the top 400 meters of the Earth makes the seismic really difficult. So it's very expensive to collect seismic and do 3D inversion, and yet you can get something out of here. So yeah, that's encouraging. Marine EM, we haven't talked very much about it, but there's gas hydrates. So around the world, here's hydrate concentrations, and the Japanese are going to be mining this, very soon, within the next year or two. C4 massive sulfides. We get these big smokers that go, the various ridges. You get black smokers, and there's all kinds of minerals that are coming up, and they come up and then they get deposited on the ocean floor. So now you've got both conductive and chargeable material on the ocean floor, and you could just go ahead and do some EM surveys over top of that. And again, the Japanese are well advanced in doing this. Other things with marine EM are large-scale tectonics. So we've got subducting slabs that go through or going down, and you're interested in finding that resistivity structure. But the other thing that's playing more of a role is looking at anisotropy. We haven't talked about that, but electrical conductivity in this direction could be different than it is in that direction, and that can tell you something about how the grains are oriented and what's happening at a rheological level. I showed this one before, but there's 2 large-scale experiments involving magnetotellurics. One is Australia, and one is the United States, a bit of Canada. These are important for a couple of reasons. One is you want to know just understanding the Earth and how it's put together. That can give you some large-scale structure. The other is very practical. The USGS is heavily invested in this. Remember I talked about these solar storms, right? So what do we got? We got this great big solar storm that's coming in. So now there's this time-varying magnetic field that's coming in. So imagine you got a power grid. So you got this big loop of wire sitting up here. That's like a big coil. And now you got a big time-varying magnetic field that's coming into that. So that's going to give you a voltage in this current loop, and that can cause havoc. In 1989, I think, there was a big power outage on the east coast of the United States and Canada. Because what happens with these power surges is if you cannot shut the transformers and the power line down fast enough, then it causes havoc. And in this particular case, there was a voltage surge that went down the line. They could not stop it, and it just hit each of these transformers. It was just like firecrackers going off. And the United States, that eastern seaboard, was basically in the dark for about 3 days. So they never want to repeat that again. So you need to now figure out, okay, what are you up against if you have a solar storm? Well, it turns out you need to know what the electric field is that's actually going into this grid system. And a lot of those electric fields are coming from the ground. So you get this empty stuff coming in, you get currents in the ground, they're snaking up into your power grid, and you've got to know what you're up against. In order to do that, they have to know the electrical conductivity structure of the region. So that's been a real impetus for why we should do MT. Then there's water. So finding it, delineating it, saltwater intrusions, pollutants, and this is part of California. So I guess SkyChem team are going to go down and with a new system and look to see what they can find for water in California. But that's clearly a big issue. Also, in physical properties, we talked about dispersive conductivity, IP. So that's got a big role to play in permafrost as well as water issues, organic materials, bioremediation, hydraulic permeability. There's all kinds of things here. One thing we never really did talk very much about was magnetic permeability. But permeability can also be dispersive, and it plays a real big role in work that is being done, let's say, with unexploded ordnance remediation, and you're trying to find these items, and it's contaminated with magnetic soils. And there might also be some bioremediation because there's certain bugs that could potentially go down and alter the size of magnetite particles and give rise to viscous remnant magnetization. Integration with multi-geophysics. This is work that my group has been doing for the last couple of years. We just published 3 papers in geophysics interpretation. But diamonds, okay, they're stable at the in the mantle, so at 100 kilometers depth. They explode. Well, they come up explosively, so there's an eruption, and then the structure might look kind of something like that, sort of tooth-like, and there's different units of kimberlite as well as sediments, and your goal is to try to not only find these guys, but also maybe to distinguish between perhaps different units. So what we've been working on is looking at here's some gravity data, here's some magnetic data, frequency domain data, and time domain data. There's 2 pipes in Canada that look like this. So all of those data have been inverted in 3D to get out different physical properties. The one that might be very interesting to the group here is the fact that we've taken the airborne sort of inductive source time domain data and extracted from that IP information and inverted that to get 3D distributions of chargeability, both at early time and late time. That might actually be of interest. So in the end, we have multiple physical property models. Those can be combined to form a rock model from geophysics, kind of asking for, okay, what's rock A? Well, it's got high density, low magnetic susceptibility, high chargeability, right? So you get different combinations, give you a different geophysical rock. And in this case, there was a very nice comparison between the geophysical rocks and the geologic rock model units from Growing. I've got a whole tutorial on this. Again, if that is of interest, we can talk about that, because I think that's the first, as far as I know, it's the first time we've actually been able to invert inductive source IP data to get a 3-dimensional distribution of chargeability. That was all work done by Soggy Kang, who's sort of the other co-disc presenter. And then we've got our future, modeling and inversion. So this has really exploded recently with cloud computing and collaborative development, open source. So we've got SimPeg, but there's also PyGimli that was developed from the Bond group, and with them try to assimilate and make sure that all the open source as much as possible can talk to each other, and just so that there's a resource for everybody to work with. And of course, we can work on GitHub and keep track of who's doing what. Then you can see we've been a big proponent of interactive software and apps to work with it. So you got visualization. So here's one of the apps, and you'll basically take Maxwell's equations or anything else and convert them to something that you can get some visuals with and play with and see what's going on. So yeah, Lindsay, as I said, we'll talk more about these tomorrow, but lots of scope there. And collaboration, just as we've been talking about here with trying to make use of the expertise at various places. We've got our open source resource, GeoSci, we've got case histories. We've already captured a few case histories from Aarhus, but there's perhaps more in other places. So these are all on our website, and you could go and not only look at them, but you could critique them, and you could add. And what we're looking for are those case histories that are really high impact, so that people who are not necessarily specialists in the field can look at this and say, oh my God, yeah, that stuff really, really works well. So that's where we are. That was the goals for the DISC. We're trying to inspire you with see a bunch of applications and illustrate the effectiveness through case histories. Build a foundation, basics of EM, exploration through apps, and our open source resource. Set some realistic expectations. I think you realize that EM is not going to give you the resolution that seismic has, unless you go to really, really high frequency in your GPR, and now you can see stuff at centimeter scale, but only down 50 centimeters or 10. And promote kind of the development of an EM community with our open source software and capturing case histories. So here we've got resources. We didn't really talk about these, but this is geophysics for practicing geoscientists. So that's kind of an open source resource that we have for introducing geophysics. Here's our EM stuff, SimPeg, our DISC. All this is kind of available through the portal. Again, Lindsay will talk more about this tomorrow. And finally, there's the DISC team. You can perhaps appreciate that it's been a monumental effort to put together all of this material. So in addition to Lindsay and Sagi, who are two co-presenters for the DISC, there's a whole big team back at UBC, and now progressively more from other universities and elsewhere that are kind of contributing to the development of this material. And without that concerted work, yeah, we wouldn't have been able to do what we did today. So I want you to join us tomorrow at DISFAT. You want to know what you're doing? And where is EM in this? Where is it playing a role? Just kind of, let's just talk, continue conversations, and talk about how we can connect with other geoscientists and how we can contribute to development of the community. I think if we could do that, that'd be great. And so I'm really encouraging that everybody, as many people as possible, can come and just share what you're doing, and we just discuss. We've had a lot of really interesting conversations about people just kind of throwing out ideas and just discussing, whether EM could work or what you'd be up against, or just seeing novel applications. So that's it. Thank you. It's been a long day. It's been a good audience.
Thank you very much, Doc. It was a pleasure. It has been a long day, but I think, at least for me, it was also very interesting. Lots of good stuff in there. So once again, just let's thank Dr.
So see you all tomorrow at DISFAT.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah, just